Good morning, afternoon, etc. everyone. As I said before, I'm in Brisbane and it's night time here. And this is my first zoo workshop, and I'm really happy to be able to come and share some ideas with a group of people who've been really thinking about zoos and zoo aesthetics and the way that zoos relate across a kind of broad kind of field of study. Because I guess, you know, given the history of zoo architecture, it hasn't been a big topic of research in the field that I'm in, which is architecture. So I didn't say before, but my background is I trained as an architect, and I worked for, 20 years as an architect. And then I've also had a career in heritage and in arts administration. So before I started doing the PhD research, I was working at an art gallery in Brisbane, and my interest in the relationship between architecture and animals was triggered by a couple of really beautiful exhibitions that were held there. One which involved kind of setting up an aviary with finches in one of the galleries, and it's quite a famous artwork. Some of you probably know it. And the other one which involved setting up a beehive in the gallery, and that included like drilling a big kind of hole in the wall, big concrete wall, drilling a hole so that the bees could get in and out to gather honey. So one of the things I thought was really fascinating, because I wasn't a big fan of zoos, was the way that when people came into the gallery, it's a very, standard kind of architecture, very modern, very reduced, that no one seemed to notice that there was this kind of, step between how we think we look at animals in a kind of natural environment. And here they were in a very abstract, very reduced kind of environment. And it was actually producing kind of different emotions in people, like the affects of both of the works was for people to evoke their curiosity about animals, but also and particularly in relation to the finches, the way that the artist had set it up. People had to come into the work and they had to be quiet. They could only come in at 10 at a time. And it was a very tender kind of relationship to these animals in these reduced environments. So I kind of started from that point thinking about the sort of, I guess, the conventional view that animals have no place in architectural spaces, and the implications that roll on from that are really quite broad, including, animals have no place in cities, so we start to kind of see how, if architecture is anti-animal, and architectural kind of environments are spreading everywhere, that this kind of gap or break between architecture and animals is actually a kind of bigger problem. And a way of I guess the way I wanted to think about that, I ended up with looking at post-war zoos. And one of the reasons I was attracted to it was because in a way, this is the best image I could find of a really people perceiving a real animosity between architecture and animals. And the Brutal Zoo plays into these sort of the whole kind of 70s kind of discourse about the naked cage. And as is well known in zoo histories, the architects kind of are the villains, and they get banished from the zoos, and landscape architects come in and make it all nice. And that's a kind of, it's a very simplistic story. It's got some truth in it, but it really still has a lot of, it's still a kind of common opinion, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. So I guess looking into it, the story's a lot more complex than that. But the thing that I'd like to discuss with you today is really how you think these buildings might cross over more broadly with literature, performance, theatre, other imagery that you've come across in relation to this kind of, brutal aesthetic, I suppose, which we can call it, which is Hal Foster's term. And he's really done, a lot of good work in looking at a number of artists and philosophers who engaged with this idea of the brute in the post-war period. And I'm also kind of, because a lot of the images of the animals, and I guess, sorry, I'll come back to Africa House very quickly, that come out of this period of the brutal zoo are very distressing images of animals, and there's a lot of kind of abject images of animals. So I've kind of also been looking at Julia Kristaver's kind of work, and I guess I think that there's a kind of crossover there. I had, what did she say? You know, brutalist aesthetics is an exploration of the boundaries between human and animal conditions, and I think it shares the concerns that Kristaver associates with the abject, with those fragile states where man strays on the territories of animal. And so I think that that kind of, they're the sorts of themes that I would really love to discuss today. And just as a bit of a aside, but to say, obviously, when I first started my research, I intended to visit these buildings, and architecture is generally studied as a kind of material, embodied, emplaced kind of thing, but circumstances have been such that the project has really then had to focus on images, and that's actually been a really interesting kind of process as well, kind of actually kind of coming to that sort of, how do we experience architecture through images, and how does architecture as backdrop or background frame animals and evoke certain kinds of affects and emotions in us when we see animals in different environments. But just one kind of odd connection, I guess, to this building in Zurich, which was built by, under the direction of Heini Hediger, who Matthew Trulu has done a lot of work on. And also I'd like to mention Christina May's work, because I know Christina's attended workshops before, and she's done a lot of the design history on these buildings as well. But one kind of slightly odd connection, which I'll just share, is that there was in the 70s at the architecture department where I'm at the University of Queensland, there was a man who was brought in to teach architecture students animal psychology. And his name was Glenn McBride, and he was known as the Chicken Man. And so he taught animal psychology to architecture students. I'm not really sure why, but everyone thought that was a good idea at the time. Anyway, McBride wrote a really nice little piece about his heroes. And just by coincidence, he said one of his heroes was a Swiss behavioural scientist, Heini Hediger, came to Australia to recommend how the zoo in Sydney should be reorganised. He visited me twice in Brisbane. This is McBride. We became friends, and I in turn visited him in Zurich. He had become famous because he understood the importance of using the evolved relationship between animals and their physical environments in designing the facilities for zoo animals. He built even simple structures like concrete termite mounds for African animals that naturally use these to rub against their bodies. And I like this bit where he says, he also knew that animals have scent glands, should be allowed to keep their quarters smelly, and prevented his staff from constantly disinfecting the quarters because the animals actually needed that smell. It made them a home. He wanted zoos to display all normal animal behaviour in natural surroundings. But McBride says, he made me face the problems of designing husbandry environments for domestic animals. This meant understanding the natural environments in which animals had evolved. He changed my life. Now I had to study how chickens behaved in the wild, a notion quite new to me. I discovered a remote island where fowl had been discarded long ago and had become feral. We went there to learn, and then he said, the publication from this study, almost 50 years old, still attracts citations weekly. Thank you, Heini. And I just, I mean, that nice kind of idea that ideas do spread, and in this kind of forum, unusual kind of connections can be made. And certainly in relation to zoo architecture and studying zoos and animals, I mean, my own experience as a scholar is that it's an incredibly intense network of unexpected connections. And so that's partly why I put together this little, set of images, because for me, they start to kind of play to some of those unexpected connections. So, I mean, this is the building. A number of people said it looked like Sydney Opera House. It's now Australia House at Zurich Zoo. It was refurbed in 2016, with quite dramatic changes. So I'll just scroll through the images, and if anyone wants to, jump in and say anything, or if you'd like any further background, I can kind of give you some more background. But I think, you all know zoos. So it had rhinos. Obviously the theme of the exhibition was the symbiotic display of rhinos, of pygmy hippos, and of a range of different kind of birds. I was particularly amazed when I saw the plan, because this is such a strongly geometric plan. It's practically what, a vesica piscis plan, which is a really a very ancient geometry that's associated with quite kind of, religious kind of symbols. The mandala is often used to display, figures of Mary and the baby and Jesus and things like that. So you can sort of see this interesting kind of, I've called it a ship shape, because I also think there's a Noah's Ark kind of connection. When you went in, you see the animals 2 by 2. So there's a kind of set of kind of resonances that you start to get, which are, do we read these into the building, or, it's kind of like, how do you actually kind of play around with those things? And then I think the other kind of interesting thing too is the image of the rhino, or the image of the animal. And I've focused here on the rhino. There are obviously other animals, but these are not naturalistic images. After the war, Swiss design actually became a kind of really famous Swiss graphic design, dominated sort of 1950s aesthetics. And this poster here was, Heidegger employed the most amazing photographers and designers at the zoo. So the sort of style level was like way up, and he had that ambition to transform the zoo into a cultural precinct and to change the kind of way that people behaved at the zoo, which I guess is that kind of affect kind of, I saw at the art gallery, the way that people would behave differently in different environments. And Heidegger also wrote, articles about, he sort of said he collected a little museum and of terrible objects that people had given or used to hurt animals. So he actually had this kind of little museum collection going about human aggression against animals at the zoo. So he kind of also was interested in that side of things. And he would often say that animals came last at the zoo. And I don't think he meant by that he put animals last. He meant that, in a way they were the least problematic. So some of those ideas are still floating around, and I think kind of misinterpreted. But I was amazed by this book cover of his famous book, because obviously most of the covers have more sedate covers. The rhino image is particularly interesting, I think, the poster image, because, sorry, it's raining here. There's this brutalist image, I suppose, of the rhino form, which suggests the building. And then it looks like kind of concrete in the background. And then, after you've looked at it for a while, you realise it's actually the shadow of the rhino on snow. So I think it's a very clever image in the way that it's been reversed, but it also plays to an idea that Heidegger had about how whether animals recognize their shadow or not might be a better test for consciousness than the mirror test. So even in this photo, in this poster, I think that there are really kind of complex kind of ideas going on. And you know, the sort of the other image, I mean, obviously plays to a certain kind of, you know, psychedelic kind of look, but also that kind of idea of the reflection and the mirror and the relationship with the other you see in the reflection. And I guess too, I'm just making kind of connections between the graphics, which was is actually quite famous too by Jacques Pancherel, who did these fabulous little animal graphics. And a lot of them I find really interesting. The rhino one is not the best one by any means. The toucan one is fabulous, but a lot of them are, the animals are actually breaking out of the frame and pointing, and you actually get the whole body of the animal, not just the part. So obviously he couldn't quite get the whole rhino in, but seems to be a little bit of a theme there too about how you actually treat and depict the animal body in relation to these things. And Fritz Hug, who's doing this drawing, he was a very well-known Swiss animal artist, so he would go along obviously drawing this, but this is also a very nice image with the animal in the foreground, and you're getting some idea about how the zoo might be experienced from the animal side. Those photographs are still reasonably rare, especially in architectural kind of presentations. So I feel like I'm doing too much talking. So does anyone want to butt in and kind of, or should I just keep going? What do you think?
Well, thank you, Gail, for this piece and for all the images. I really appreciate it. I was struck by the visitors comment that you included. I thought it was really interesting that they were able to understand their own future trajectory through identification with the animal in terms of spatial biopolitics. And there's like a hopeful melancholy to the identification, which is predicated on an unexpected identification, right? And so way to have speculate and subvert the power balance between the specific visitor and then the specific animals they're looking at. I thought the comment showed a disconnect between biology and architecture for social design overall across species, but especially for underprivileged communities and those experiencing trauma, though I don't know details about this specific visitor. But I wonder, and this isn't really a question directed at you, but just a reflection. I wonder if the visitor or other visitors who can position themselves as the animal in the zoo can see the nuances and histories of animalization and race and religious violence, for example, or sexual violence, and how that would create differences in future trajectories, however dystopic or utopic that future trajectory is. But anyway, I thought including the comment was a very useful thing to do. So thank you.
Yeah, I found that, comment quite amazing, really, because the vast majority of comments are really along the, that the architecture is cruel, and so he kind of found a way of and I guess that there is a kind of really interesting kind of aspect to the comments that people make about their childhood kind of understanding of things as well, which can be quite different to the conventional kind of way of relating. But there's definitely trauma involved in the whole kind of ambivalent feeling about whether these buildings are protective or prisons. So there's a kind of tension. Heidegger explains that the Zurich Zoo is on the Zurichberg. It's in a very exposed position. The animals the tropical animals need to be protected. So in some ways you could see that the architecture is like the protective kind of bunker as well as the enclosing bunker. And that was also a kind of common theme, with Paul Varelio's work and other people's work who've written about the post-war relationship to bunkers, where you kind of get this sort of, ambivalent kind of feeling about whether the solid walls can protect you. And I think that there's an ambivalence there in relation to whether we're protecting animals or enclosed, caging them. Obviously, it's both, but there's some kind of curious reversals going on with the relationship to, the idea that the wild is also kind of like controlled and contained. You start to see some really interesting reversals in the research. Like one of the things that fascinates me in current research is the way that scientists are looking at how zoo animals adapt to new environments for the purposes of studying how they might be able to get animals who are relocated in the wild to adapt to new environments. So that kind of, the animal and their house is kind of, also now being studied to see how animals in the wild can experience those sorts of transitions to new and strange environments. And I guess too, it's, I think coming back, I'm not sure if this is quite what you're saying, but I think that obviously defamiliarization is a common kind of aesthetic kind of theme, and these buildings are almost deliberately strange and estranging, and I can't quite imagine whether that was deliberate. Okay, it sort of comes out of a kind of cultural context rather than being a deliberately radical move on the part of zoo directors to estrange their communities from their zoo exhibits. Surprisingly enough, though, or maybe not surprisingly, that is exactly what happened. Like the zoo almost started the conversation about that the zoos themselves started a self-critique in the post-war period and said zoos aren't good enough, and that was a way of kind of raising kind of awareness about how these reforms in zoos had to happen, that animals were endangered. And that conversation, which as far as I can tell, starts in the zoo, goes out into the community and then is used as a critique back at the zoo. So the zoo actually sort of sets in motion the critique that actually kind of comes back at it. And so there's sort of some interesting, I guess, dialectics about how those kinds of conversations unfold and where their source is. So I kind of, one of the things I think is really nice about this building, which a lot of the other buildings I'm studying don't have, is this symbiotic kind of relationship, and the fact that it has these big kind of sort of fancy windows and kind of hooded skylights, but it's all very kind of related to the animals because it's an aviary, and it gives the birds these beautiful kind of spaces which aren't just a sort of flat ceiling and kind of moving about. So you've kind of got all this light, and it was a lot of vegetation in the building when it was looking its best. Obviously with zoo buildings too, you get that. They don't always look great because there are a lot of hard work to kind of keep in that way. But I mean, these images of the birds and, the rhinos in their dens, I mean, people might think they look horrible, but they're quite religious, I think. They're quite devotional, and there's quite a big crossover with post-war church design and the light flooding in from the top and all those kinds of things. So, I mean, if anyone's got any kind of comments about that kind of sacred aspect of the zoo animal, and particularly in this period. But I think that there's definitely relates to the kind of concerns that are burst out almost immediately after the war about fears about animal extinction, particularly focused on Africa. you know, and so there's a kind of colonialist and post-colonialist kind of connection very strongly in that. And part of, I think, what modern architecture is trying to do is sort of neutralize some of those connections as well by kind of falling back on the universals, you know, that rationalism and functionalism and those kinds of things will clean up all that mess, you know, all that kind of messy kind of, you know, unresolved stuff. I mean, of course it doesn't, but I think there's a certain kind of attempt to do that. And here are all the adorable birds. And I don't know if anyone else has found this, but you know, all the zoo chat, social media type stuff has the most fabulous photographs and information for the stuck-at-home scholar, and people's comments and things like that. So a lot of these photographs come from people having kind of visited, and people upload their old photographs too. So, you know, you get some fabulous historical or post-war historical kind of photographs appearing. But I should say that in relation to the birds, the symbiosis was not entirely successful. So they sort of, I think they started out with the cattle egrets, and then they moved to the oxpeckers, and, you know, there were a number of kind of deaths with one type of bird attacking the other. Not bad. There's a nice little article kind of summarising it, the research later on. But one of the things which I think is kind of ironic is that, you know, Heidegger was a follower of Uexküll, and Uexküll was famous for his work on the tick. And one of the things that made the symbiosis not work was that there was no ticks. And so the birds that would normally feed on the ticks actually started pecking too hard and tearing the skin of the rhinos, which, you know, is also another kind of brutalist irony, I suppose, in that, you know, pachyderms are supposed to have this really thick, hard skin, but in fact it's quite sort of thick but soft. And a lot of the design you can see in the photo of the bird on the back of the pygmy hippo, a bit of timber that was placed on the wall. And so this is, I think, also another kind of really interesting aspect of this building, was that the architects sort of did all the hard concrete-y stuff, and then there were all these attachments. They were planned attachments. It was always planned to be like this, but it's almost like there's a layer that the zoo biologists have added, because the layer is like you've got this kind of abstract kind of and geometric and symbolic forms, and then you've got these quite literal references to trees and wood, and there's also the steps that were into the hippo pool. Christian Schmidt, who was the curator, says that they were modelled on a natural kind of step. So you've got this intersection between a kind of tendency towards wanting to create kind of symbols of the human-animal kind of relationship and a kind of set of relationships, and these really quite literal emblems of trees and steps and water, and they were also put in there for very practical purposes. The purposes being to prevent the rhinos and the other animals from rubbing off their horns and their skin on hard surfaces. So you've kind of got that play between soft and hard kind of and you know, lively bodies and the architecture, kind of how they interact. But yeah, no tick. So, I mean, and I think these are interesting kinds of questions that are still playing out in the zoo, is like, you know, at this period, very much like one of the things that was said over and over again about animals being in the zoo was, oh, they're much better off in the zoo, they've got no parasites, you know, blah, blah. So and we give them lots of medicine, and, you know, I have in this research spent some time looking at what animals were given. There's some absolutely horrifying articles about, you know, reports on dosages of, tranquilizers or other kinds of drugs given to animals and whether it killed them or not. Oh, this much, yep, dead, so like all laid out in nice scientific tables, but it's the most kind of, that kind of aspect of how I guess medicine and things played out, and the kind of idea that symbiosis ends up being pictorial, I guess, in a way, because you remove the critters, you remove the people, the animals and that make it work because they're bad animals or unacceptable in these circumstances, and that, I guess, that rich kind of texture of the life can't be recreated in the zoo, and the challenge always is what can be recreated. And I think Heidegger he did understand that, because of the way he spoke about wanting to translate or transpose the key kind of things that could be transposed. But I guess I'll just quickly go through this.
There are two hands up. Maybe I wonder if.
Great. Sorry, I'm not very good at hands. So.
That's okay. I encourage people just to jump in. Really, Carlos had his hand up for a while, and Carlo, do you want to?
Yeah. No, I just by reading your notes and then listen to what you're saying, my first reaction was to how do you, or how Heidegger did, conciliate the tenet of his revolution, which is to put the biological needs of animals at the center of his idea of zoo, and this brutal or brutalist architecture, which to a first sight doesn't look very much animal friendly.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's exactly right. It doesn't look animal friendly. It's totally surprising from our perspective. Now, when we're so used to a kind of nature simulation in the zoo, to actually, see this as anything other than, absolutely inappropriate. And I kind of, that's actually my starting point, really, in terms of looking at this. But there are a couple of interesting kind of little, I guess, kind of ways into the problem for me is, one of them is I think I tried to take seriously the zoo's kind of claim that its educational strategy by exhibiting the animals is to change people's attitudes. And this is the brutal zoo is one of the few examples where, my God, it changed people's attitudes, and that's actually reflected in the literature too, that, people will go, oh, it was terrible, but at least it did this, at least people started to care. So if you kind of relate that back to artistic strategies of defamiliarization or kind of abjectness, it's a political kind of gesture when we look at it in human kind of art. And I'm just wondering how we kind of think about that in relation to something which actually totally agree. I mean, it looks totally inappropriate. No one would plan to rebuild these things, except I should say that very recently, well, not that recently, in the last 5 years, architecture and star architecture has started to come back to the zoo. And when I look at the recent architecture, like the panda enclosure in Copenhagen by big architects who are very, world kind of important architect, you're starting to see brutalist architecture coming back in. So I guess that's where the critique kind of goes to, would you ever want to see this happen again? Because in a way it is. Like, you can see some of the gestures of it in the refurb of the Paris Zoo by Bernard Schumi and his associates, and also the Copenhagen, So I guess what happened was there's like a 30-year period, and David Hancock's, who's written a lot about this, he basically said, architects are the wrong consultants for zoos. You shouldn't have architects at zoos. You should have landscape architects. They understand about ecology, all those kinds of things. So these are the sorts of conversations that came directly out of the crisis of this kind of architecture. and it was
But
strong.
what surprised me was precisely that was Heidegger.
Yeah.
Everybody doing or allowing this kind of.
Yeah. I think that's right. I should say, in Heidegger's defense, this building worked really well. The rhinos stayed in it till 2015. They bred. Some of the other buildings I'm looking at, I can't say that about. In fact, I've got some real tragedies on my hands, but this building did work for the rhinos, and they were, they didn't kind of have any, they had, I think, no real kind of, death by exhibit, which they certainly did in other places. So I think, but it's very interesting because there's a wonderful little video where Terry Maple, who's an American zoo director, and he goes to talk to Heine Heidegger, and they're actually sitting in this building having a glass of wine in front of the rhinos and the hippos, and they're talking about how, zoos should zoos should be natural. And Heidegger says, I'm not into this nature simulation stuff. I don't want plastic trees and, all that stuff in my zoo. We've got plenty of bushes and shrubs, that we can put in with the animals. So here's kind of, I guess that sort of question of the natural actually occurs for him also at the level of not just what it looks like, but the actual kind of biological material itself. So I think that's kind of interesting. But yeah, it's really interesting. In zoo history, they do not talk about Grudel Zoo precisely because it confuses the hell out of people, because there's a sort of gap between, the bad antiseptic zoo and the natural zoo. And this is the gap, right? And no one knows really what to do with it, because Heidegger, who's like in one hand held up as the sort of beginning of the ecological, biological approach, is actually, very much tied up with, these big, strong concrete buildings. So yeah, it's a really good point. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's interesting.
Would you be able to talk a little bit more about defamiliarization and abjection as a political gesture? Do you mean defamiliarization for the viewer or for the animal, or both?
I think that the animal absolutely faced defamiliarization when it came to the zoo, and probably constantly. So for the animal, this is, Heidegger does really talk about this in some very interesting, I mean, didn't want to overload this, but there's a really interesting kind of thing he writes about to do with okapi trapping in the Congo, where he goes to the Congo and he sees this okapi trapping happen. And one of the things that he writes about is how they build a pit, and they capture the animal. And when the animal's captured, they build all these walls around it. So they make these bush walls, and they do it progressively and very quickly. But it's very interesting because he said that the okapi adjusts to these changes very seamlessly and isn't panicked. So there's this whole kind of process whereby the animal is being subjected to capture and then transport. And he, for the first, he sees this kind of example of how using, techniques that are familiar to the people who live in the forest, that they can capture this animal without frightening it and alerting it. And then, they leave it and they let it get used to it. And they kind of actually, after a few days, they're kind of handling it and brushing it and cleaning it. So that, I think, is this kind of idea about shock, and how much the animal is shocked by that transfer to the zoo is actually really, there's quite a lot of about that in the literature, because they had animals dying all the time from that shock. So the defamiliarization is definitely part of what the animals experience. And I think that's a kind of good point. I haven't really thought about that in a way that, does that kind of realization actually kind of at least partly lie behind the idea that, the defamiliarization for the viewer is also a kind of, or the human spectator is also a kind of a way of trying to understand that, you know, these animals don't belong here. You know, you know, this is, we're caring for them, we're doing all these things, but it's not like it's their place. So it's a sort of tension, I think, between that kind of care and that kind of how you present that care. And of course, I mean, I should say, if you look at any of the behind the scenes kind of images of zoos, and Nigel Rothfels has done that beautiful book on the elephant house, which is not this period, it's later, but there's all these images which I think are very confronting images of for a lot of people of what the, you know, the brutal architecture that lies behind the kind of palm tree fronts. You know, this is where the zoo animals still hang out. So Brutal Zoo went back of house, we could say. And, you know, so I think that's the kind of other aspect of it. But yes, I mean, I haven't really kind of nailed all of these questions about the aesthetics down, but, you know, I kind of, you know, I'm interested in all those overlaps, like the fact that Rhinoceros was one of the most popular plays in Europe at the same time. You know, it showed in Zurich in 1960. It raced across, you know, Europe and London. You know, it was like the image of the rhino was everywhere. So I kind of feel like people were more kind of interested in this strange presentation of the animal. I don't know, could I open that up to the floor? I mean, I might be running out of time, so I kind of wonder what anyone thinks about that kind of in terms of, I mean, certainly in literature, and I think, Kari, you've kind of looked at a lot of this sort of the image of the animal as strange or traumatized or out of place is not uncommon in literature. It's just, you know, where does that fit in at the zoo? And I guess too, I'll kind of come back to a personal kind of view. I find the simulated zoo quite creepy a lot of the time. And so I kind of get the feeling of the uncanny still haunts the zoo, you know, so that they're the kinds of images that I'm kind of trying to kind of unravel there.
I just was nodding along to your comments on the uncanniness. I was really drawn to this zoo at first because of what seemed to me the lack of falseness. They're not going to pretend an animal could be comfortable or at home here in these big slabs of concrete. But my question from a few minutes ago was about sort of the accoutrements within that appeal either to the animals or to the visitors, like that little sign that's supposed to be spoken by an animal, I suppose, that says, please be careful, this is my home, or I'm at home here, or something. And the trees and the light and the sort of the whimsy within the brutalism, and the tussle there is really striking to me and its own source of something uneasy making.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose that's what I value about it, like uneasiness in the viewer is not necessarily a kind of, you know, bad per se. I mean, if you want to, and that there's so much, you know, I guess the sort of standard educational approach is to make the human happy. You know, if you make them happy and feel happy, then they'll do happy things and they'll be nice to animals and donate to conservation. And yet, on the other hand, we have animal activists, and this comes in really strongly here. The animal activists got a lot of really juicy images from the Brutal Zoo. And even quite, you know, Britta Jasinski's photographs, some of you might know, Randy Malamuth wrote about them. But one of the things I found quite interesting about what he said about his work with her was, yeah, it takes a really long time. We've got to go to the zoo and we've got to wait for just the right image, you know, like the normal sort of thing a photographer would say. But it's kind of like interesting to me that you have to wait around to get a really bad image, you know, like that. Those are in themselves very much framed up, you know, they're not, hey, it'll look like this all the time. And, you know, to me, that kind of image, and it's so interesting because the images that were published in the architectural journals in 1965 big flashy spreads showing not this building, but some of the other buildings. I'm particularly thinking of the brutalist Elephant House in London. And they look hardly any different from the images that Britta Jasinski did to say these animals are suffering. So on the one hand, you've got these images that show graphic elephants, beautiful building, and then the other, it's like, oh, tragedy. So you kind of see how little change there is between those images, and a lot of it must lie in the contextualization and framing of how we read these images. And, so I think this sleeping hippo with the bird on him is an absolutely cute as image, right? But for a lot of people, they might worry that it's dead. And a lot of the photographs I've seen where like terrible, these animals in cages, and they're all just having a nap, So there is a bit of jazzing going on both sides, I suppose, in terms of how those images are used. But it's that ambiguous kind of connection, I suppose, that I find interesting too. And, I guess there were more kind of weird connections like this spread here, I think is particularly disturbing. And I don't know much about this photographer, but he's a strange guy. Like he was like, hung out at all the New York clubs in the kind of, 70s. And he was a real playboy, and he did a lot of Vogue model shoots, knew all the top models, and, does kind of like weird imagery. But he was also tied up with those big African wildlife surveys, and he took the sort of famous photographs of the dead elephants that kind of resulted in, all the kind of planned elephant killings that happened in the sort of 60s and 70s. So that, you can see in these images some real, like horrible stuff. But it's actually kind of hard to tell sometimes whether, you're looking at a dead animal or, an animal that's really, he also took really kind of, animals in their glory, if you like, as well. But he kind of really, crunches a whole lot of stuff together in his work. And his book, The End of the Game, was quite an important book in terms of, promoting the idea of the crisis of wildlife in Africa. But he was also tied up with hunters. So, you kind of get this kind of I find very uncomfortable melange of things going on. So kind of teasing those apart, not collapsing them all together, I think is important. And I guess the sort of focus on the cave art and the animal-human relationship that was unraveled is very much part of what Hal Foster is looking at when he looks at Bataille and his relationship to his writing about Lachaud. And, I kind of just thought, these images have been, I think it's kind of fairly well accepted that they're not interpreted, that the meaning remains not able to be understood. But, I was kind of like looking at these dots in terms of, are they really rhino poos? What are those dots? And is this kind of like, scatological kind of, image? And, you kind of think, oh, dung. It's everywhere in zoos. And, would an artist be painting dung? And, curiously, I kind of, this is also the sort of, and you will have seen this, but, the sort of poster that actually tells the person to beware of being shat on is like, it's kind of sort of not that dissimilar. But, this is this kind of attempts to understand these kinds of relationships through geometries and through different kinds of compositional strategies. And, you kind of start to kind of see all these strange kind of ways of trying to bring these together. And anyway, you start seeing rhinos everywhere because I could not believe this plan of Zurich Zoo looked like a rhino. It was like, what? So you kind of got the, you know, the mouth here and the horns, and I think it's kind of like has a very strange resemblance to. So, you know, I just throw that out there for. And also I should say, in terms of the dung, one of the other, the elephant house that I'm looking at, there is actually, there was an artist who won the Turner Prize for, and one of the things he did was collect the elephant dung and paint on the elephant dung. So there's quite a tradition of elephant dung art that actually relates to, you know, black kind of African painting, which I won't go into, but it's kind of like there's also that kind of interesting connection between contemporary art and animal dung collected at zoos. And I guess that, you know, I'm really just kind of wanting to finish by kind of reminding us that, you know, it's not natural. Or should I not use that term, but it's geoengineered. Zoos are incredibly intense places of disruption of the local landscape. And, you know, there's a few kind of good examples where that isn't the strategy, but to create Kenya on the Zurichberg is no small kind of matter. And you've also got this, you know, very interesting kind of, you know, connection now, because this is sort of modelled on the Lewis Savannah in Kenya, which is funded by the Zurich Zoo. And then the Lewis Savannah in Kenya is kind of modelled on the Zurich Zoo. So you start to get this kind of, you know, to and fro between how the design is playing out. And, you know, it's just, if anyone's ever been to a zoo when they're rebuilding, I mean, you know, there's not a blade of grass, there's not a microbe left on those scraped and tunneled and buried sites, and a lot of the services are put underground, and, you know, you're starting to sort of see, and you know, the fake tree industry is doing very well at zoos. So I kind of guess, you know, is this also the brutal zoo? I don't know. So this is, and the other thing that breaks my heart in a way is that the black rhino community was at Zurich from, you know, I think, I forget exactly, but the late 1950s, and when they did the Lewis Savannah, they stopped having the black rhinos, so that this, you know, multi-generational community that had lived in that house was disbanded. And to me, in a way, I think that's one of the ethical questions about zoos. If you set up a community, what are your obligations to that ongoingness of that community, and who is that community? And in fact, it's always like, oh no, they've been freed, you know, they're not here anymore. And one of the reasons that that the black rhinos aren't kept is because the white rhino is more suitable to this kind of open savanna kind of setup. And I haven't been able to find exactly anyone saying this, but my suspicion is that the white rhino was thought to be extinct in the 19th century. And then it was, a few herds were rediscovered. And, you know, effectively, and I'm going out on a limb here a bit, but effectively the white rhino has been being ranched since the 19th century. So the idea that the white rhino is more docile is probably a product of basically domestication, and that the black rhino gets booted out of the zoo because its behaviour doesn't actually fit into the new visual paradigm. So, you know, that it's kind of like, you know, does anyone place any value on that zoo community and that ongoingness of that, of a commitment to a particular species that you've taken on? But, you know, one of the baby, there was a really cute, the baby, I've got to show you the baby because everyone loves the zoo babies. this really cute baby, whoops. Anyway, forget the baby. The really cute baby, Modi, was born, only months before the zoo exhibit closed. And so the mother and baby had to be relocated. And, I was like, well, what happened to them? And when quite recently, the baby, kind of much more grown up, has been sent back to a reserve in Africa, believe it or not, which, I was a bit kind of all teary when I found that out. And it was a really, heartrending kind of ending to the black rhino story, in Zurich. So.
Okay,
thank
you. I think we may need to thank you very much for this very interesting collection of, and I until you pointed it out, I hadn't noticed that the Zurich Zoo floor plan looks like a rhino, but now that you mention it, I'm also starting to see rhinos everywhere.
Yeah, they do that to you. Thanks, everyone.
So I want to give the floor to Marcela, and because, so officially this, we only have half an hour left, but because there's one speaker fewer in the next session, I think we can probably spend 45 minutes and start again at 3, or even longer, but I want to give Marcela the floor.
Thank you. Carrie, can you also give me?
I think everyone has it now.
Okay, so let me see. What should I do? I don't know how to do that.
There's a big green button at the bottom that says share screen.
Oh yeah, that's true. Okay, can you see it?
Yeah.
Good. I think there are some very interesting points of connection with Gail's presentation and materials and reflections. The title of my presentation changed, as you can see. I wasn't aware that the dynamics of this series of workshops was to actually give in advance the whole material and text that would be discussed. So I didn't really have something until a couple of days ago, something really organized. And I have to say that these are just this is not even a work in progress. It's really a work that is beginning. So that's why there's, I have some intuitions, but I don't really have like a thesis. So I'm just going to begin. So as you probably all know, the first anthropozoological exhibition, as Hagenbeck himself called them, was held at the Tierpark in Hamburg in 1874 with a group of 6 members of the Sami tribe and some 30 reindeer. Hagenbeck found it as crucial to reproduce the native environment of the peoples as it was to construct diverse scenes of natural animal life in the zoo. The recreation of the original habitat of each people, or at least a habitat wild enough to convince viewers that it was authentic, was one of the main points of reference for the design of further human and/or animal exhibitions. Among them, prominently was the colonial expositions at the Jardin d'Acclimatation in Paris, where the filming of the Lumière brothers that I sent you within the couple of things I sent you as materials, where they took place, and also many iterations of the anthropological studies from anthropology aficionado Félix Louis Regnault, who produced series of chronophotographs specifically aimed at reproducing a narrative where movement and gesture were of fundamental importance. As Fatima Tobin-Brony says, the narrative coincides with that of all ethnographic film, which is a wide-ranging category for her, and it includes this kind of chronophotography that you see in the screen, and also more sophisticated productions as the one I also linked you, the film Taboo, which I will comment on later on. And the narrative is that of evolution, of course. The natives were, according to Tobin-Brony, people who were not meant to be seen as individuals, but as specimens of race and culture, specimens which provided the viewer with a visualization of their own evolutionary past. So stills, chronophotographs, and film all constitute exceptional media to display the anxieties and the tensions that were present in this colonial setting in particular, but also in most acts of mediated looking. How is the observer supposed to or allowed to observe? And how is the observed expected to look back? What happens when these expectations are not met? Looking at one of Regnault's series, the one we're looking at in the screen, Tobin-Brony claims, and I quote, "A Frenchman dressed in a city suit and hat accompanies the woman as she walks, never taking his eyes off her. His walk, meant to represent the urban walk, is there as comparative point of reference to what Regnault terms the woman's savage locomotion. In addition, he acts as an in-frame surrogate for the Western male gaze of the scientist. There are also two other performers visible at the frame left. I think you can see them more clearly at the center image. These two other performers are watching the Frenchman watch the woman. And finally, there's a little girl, also West African, who stares alternatively at the group being filmed and the scientist and his camera. So you can look at her also in the center, in the middle image of the series. It's not very easy to see her, but if you look closely, attentively, you can see her. And at this very moment, she's looking at the camera, or that is at least what Tobin-Brony observed. So what I would like to point your attention towards is the distant, almost panoramic camera setting of this series. This is telling of the politics of the colonial gaze in this particular context, which clearly separated subject from object, culture from nature, civilized from savage in Jensen, how is this called, this thing?
Quotation marks.
Quotation marks, thank you. The same politics was present in the choosing of a place for the 1931 Exposition Coloniale Internationale, which was held for 6 months at the Bois de Vincennes in the outskirts of Paris. This venue was specifically designed to comply with the official French policy of association, a strict segregation of cultures and a fixed hierarchical relationship between France and its colonies. It was important to maintain, however, that these policies were kept invisible in a way, invisible as such, in order to transmit the perception that these villages, these natural settings were actual replicas of the non-Western world, and not that they were a production, a construction, an invention of the native life. The pathway that went from the section métropolitaine through the colonial section and then to end at the zoological park at this 1931 exposition had a pedagogical character. It guided visitors in a kind of reverse evolutionary order from contemporary human civilization to ahistorical animal savage, at once communicating the connection between Europe, especially France, and its colonies, while simultaneously insisting upon their physical and temporal separations. So the fact that the site for the Exposition Coloniale was chosen at the Bois de Vincennes is also telling of this idea. This was not a park or a garden, but a forest. And that is a place where wild things are expected, where it was described as taboo and as heavily touched by the supernatural and the sacred, but still untouched by the civilizing order, and at the outer edge of the metropolis, yet close enough to attract city dwellers from around the world. The experience of the visitor to the exposition was marked by an epistemic approach that was decidedly visual. Fences separated them from the native villages, and masses of water from the exotic animals, as in the model developed by Hagenbeck. When the time came for a performance to dance, sing, or represent a ritual purportedly proper to their culture, they frequently did it up on a stage. This separation corresponds with the disciplinary scopic regime, where visitors are constantly reminded of their status. They are spectators of a spectacle. So I would like you to look at this image here with the lion group. Notice, however, the gesture of this photograph. The spectatorship regime that I just mentioned rules the relation between the metropolitan visitors, which you can see in the back of the background of the frame, and the natural world, represented, of course, by the group of animals, while another regime, this is what I have been observing, characterizes the relation between the man with the camera. It was in all likelihood a man. And in fact, because of the bee at the left, right corner, it was probably from the Brune operators who were contracted by this Exposition Coloniale to make archives of this event. So the relationship is different between the spectators of the spectacle of animal or natural life and the cameraman in relation to this natural world. And what I want to explore, or what I've been looking at, is that this closer relationship is allowed not only thanks to the camera devices themselves, you know, the technological medium, but also they kind of changed through time, because the codes, the cinematographic codes also changed. And so therefore you can see the difference that the first images had in relation to this distance, this like scopic, spectacular regime, and now like a much closer look at this animal, you know, supposedly forbidden, taboo animal or natural world or life. So indeed, many of the photographs and films that registered the exposition tended to provide a rather haptic experience. They were taken inside the spaces that were restricted for visitors, and they portrayed their subjects' every movement, even their most minute facial gestures, as they engaged in activities as quotidian as eating a meal. And there's actually studies that look at all these moments of eating meals that were like very, like particularly interesting for this cameraman for some reason. So at this point, it is worth stating that, you know, my theoretical intuition, so to speak, with this set of images is that, and I still have to concentrate on a more specific corpus of images and films, but that there is a differentiated pattern in the scopic regimes of ethnographic and zoologic imagery from the beginnings of the moving image at the end of the 19th century, which are also represented by the small video clip that I sent you, the Bagnade de Nègre, so it's called, to more contemporary accounts of the unstable relations that still pervade context of racialized ethnographic spectacle involving other animals, symbolically or physically. And the patterns are spectacular distance versus haptic closeness. So the next oh, sorry. In this image, you can look at film still from the movie Taboo, which I also linked within the materials I gave you. And it is fairly easy to see the difference that a little over 30 years made to the technologies and the cinematographic or linguistic register. So you can see how this very close look at not only the woman subject, but also like she is the most precious virgin of this island, and she is the object of the taboo. And yet the camera comes really close to her, and the body of this courteous man is in complete proximity to her body, and is as if you saw the movie or even the trailer, he's actually the one that breaks the spell, so to speak, or the transgresses the law of the taboo. In this image, it seems to me, as you can see here, the camera is already accompanying the man going in the boat to the water, to the point where there is also an area that is legendarily within the plot of the movie a taboo. It's an area that is protected by a shark that guards the precious pearl of the South Seas. And there's also kind of an unwritten law that anyone who attempts to reach these depths and touch the perils that lie in these depths will be punished. And so it's also a kind of like a symbolic prohibition of virginity as well, of reaching towards something that's virgin, that's untouched by the hand of man, and not only the hand of man, but the hand of dominating culture, etc. So it seems to me that in this film, the camera operates as a suspensor, at least in some instance, of the tension between this spectacular distance proper to the civilized, quotation marks, audience, and the desired but normatively improper haptic closeness to the natural, the savage, and the animal. This functions both symbolically, as I said, as in the case of Rary, and literally, as in the case of the shark, whose depths, water, and body are attacked, as you can see in the next image. Well, this is actually an even closer look from the camera that goes underwater, where this precious pearl lies. And then we see an absolute, almost ridiculous close-up of the shark. It's obviously not a shark, but it's supposed to be. And then we see how the protagonist, the human protagonist, actually attacks this shark from the bottom up. So it kind of transgresses this bodily limit as well. So it goes into the bowels of this organism. And now I would like you to take a look at the trailer of a video of this performance, which some of you may already know. It's a video made of the various stagings of this performance called The Couple in the Cage, Two Undiscovered Amerindians Visit the West. So artists Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Peña featured themselves as representatives from an undiscovered island near the Gulf of Mexico and spent hours at a time in different museums around the world. One of the most notable presentations was at the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History, an institution with a legacy of displaying human subjects and which was actually built for the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, a celebration of the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus' arrival in the quotation marks New World. The Couple in the Cage was held precisely 100 years later, starting in 1992. Neither of the field museum nor any of the other museums displayed the artists as human oddities, of course, of an undiscovered island, but the results of the performance went beyond the artists' very expectations. So in the next clip, it's just a minute, I would like you to please notice how the presence of the photographic camera functions as this suspensor of distance versus touching, even through the bars of the cage.
Marcela, should we be hearing sound right now?
Oh yeah, are you not?
Yeah, you might have to unshare and reshare again. There's a little box that you have to click that says like share sound
Okay.
when you start sharing.
I'm gonna stop and then go ahead again. Do you hear it now? No. You don't hear it, right?
No, we can't hear anything.
I don't see the sound.
It's when you hit the
Oh.
green button and like go to start sharing, there's a little box at the bottom that you have to check that says something along the lines of share sound when you share your screen.
Now? Did you hear something? No.
No, still not.
No.
I think you have to unshare again and reshare.
Okay.
Sometimes also headphones can get confusing with the.
Yeah, let's.
Oh yeah, maybe it's just playing in your ear.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
So I'm gonna.
I study a lot of the Indians. I do a lot of traveling out west, and I study a lot about the Indians. But this is one tribe that I didn't know of.
I have no idea what they're talking. I asked whether they were Mayans. They said that they didn't know. I just find it really strange. I've never heard about it. I've been in Guatemala and I read a lot about like American Indians, and I've never heard about this. But it's the concept of having like two human beings caged to show around and to be calling them specimens. Like they're human beings, you know, they have a name.
Strangest of all to me, perhaps, was the fact that these people who lack all our comforts, all our science, all our civilization, seemed to me yet happier and more free than we are.
Okay, so do you hear me? Okay. Just like the two themes that I would that are of interest for me in relation to this sequence of images that I showed you are well, the differentiated scopic or epistemic regimes prompted by camera devices as they go through transformations, both at the technical and at the linguistic cinematographic levels. And of course, this has to be refined in a more situated or nuanced manner in order not to produce totalizing narrative, because that's not my intention. And well, how do these regimes change when a Western metropolitan audience comes into contact with a non-Western other, be it human or animal, in the presence of a camera? And then the other aspect is the necessity that the native architecture and aesthetics somehow are maintained as recreations. That is, on the one hand, they need to be more real than the real thing, as wild or as animal as possible, regardless of real authenticity. But on the other hand, this kind of has to produce a kitsch effect, an excessive effect, which brings back the element of the spectacle. So these are the two things I would like to further explore. And yeah, I'm happy to hear your comments, questions. Thank you.
Well, just to jump in, Marcela, I mean, I can certainly see some overlap with us both exploring kind of the idea of discomfort in the viewer. And I kind of also really related to the concept of distance and proximity, which was also, I think, a kind of big theme in, exploring different ways of interacting with animals, even as a kind of quite contrived activity, like at the zoo. One of the designers I'm looking at, he talked in a 1957 article about not just wanting to see animals from a distance over moats, but to feel, he called it the hot breath on the face. And, it was meant to be a kind of like, that kind of different kind of way of experiencing the other. So there are all those kinds of ideas which, start to kind of appear in that same period. But I was also very interested in, and I kind of haven't worked out how I would play this out, but that theme of distance and proximity and that tension between, intimacy good, distance bad, kind of idea where, we're now in a kind of regime of zoonotic, disease hysteria probably, where that kind of question of intimacy with animals gets flipped. And, certainly in terms of the danger to animals from wanting to be too close is also a kind of question. So that those kinds of things, the sort of value judgments attached to them, I find interesting how mobile they are in terms of how they're used with specific technologies and intents, particularly the camera. So yeah, I think it's kind of they're very interesting questions to be asking. Yeah, I find it also, fascinating to think about this tension between proximity and distance, because there's really an effective need or desire to come close to this thing that has been kind of repressed in a way, but not so much as to actually come into this world. It's like the zoo, even as an institution, brings this natural world, like to the context of the city and encloses this environment in a way that we can still be close, but just not too much, not. Yeah. And then all these phenomena happen that are so commented and spectacular as well, when something goes wrong and then an animal
harms a person or something like this. No. And Kari, I think you had asked something in the chat. What were you referring to? I didn't.
I was wondering about I was just surprised because I haven't seen Taboo. I only watched the trailer, and I don't think there was. I was just wondering about the technology of the underwater shots. I mean, I assume that that they weren't really underwater at that time.
They were really underwater.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, but I guess they were not so deeply underwater as you know, as it seems, because it really seems like they are there in the depths of the sea. I think they're quite as a my German just comes is awful. They don't go deep into the water, but they are in the water.
I see.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Because from the still, it was difficult to tell, and I thought perhaps it had been filmed like at an aquarium.
No, I don't think so.
I also wanted to jump in with a question about that film, Taboo, and I haven't seen it either. I've only watched the trailer. But I was interested in the way in which the visual, which you talked about a little bit, interacts with the narrative of the film, and how the narrative resolves the kind of problem of the taboo. I mean, is the narrative of the film about transgression, about these two people entering a kind of modern relationship because they managed to escape the taboo?
Exactly. You know, the taboo is kind of a I mean, there are two taboos, so to speak. There's the written taboo of this kind of legendary woman that represents virginity and pureness and you know, link with nature, and then there's this other taboo which is already on the side of another island where the colonial forces are already in charge. So in Bora Bora, in the first island, the natives rule, so to speak, no? But then in this other island where this couple already having transgressed the first taboo, they travel to this other island, and around this other island is the other taboo, which is unwritten, but it's traditionally this spot is known to be you know, not possible to violate. So it is a narrative of you know, hubris that is linked to a civilizatory process and to the colonial power of France.
And the unwritten one is the one that has a big sign on it that says taboo. Yes. Yeah, okay. So it's not entirely unwritten.
Yes, exactly.
Marcela, I was wondering, just in case if it is of any use, I was wondering if you knew concerning the underwater sequence about this film that has been featured as the first underwater film that involves also a shark and I believe also a horse, just in case that reference.
What's the name of the film?
I think I was looking at it now, and it is The Terrors of the Deep. Well, this is the YouTube link I have just found, so I can post it in the chat.
Thanks. Yeah.
Because I remember looking into, because I was interested for a while in not systematically, but look a bit about underwater films, and this came about. So, and also you were talking about the aptic and distances, and also I believe that this, and well, again about the underwater thing, it has come, I remember right now, like Donna Haraway has addressed these in relationship with the pain level films, I believe, that are also underwater films. And I think it has to, this related with the thing, I believe that the water being, you are immersed in water and the water touches you and things and along these lines. So maybe, and I believe this was in when a species meets, I think she was addressing this there in case also if I can.
Yes, thank you. It's a very good tip. And if you're interested, all of you, I mean, the whole video of the couple in the cage is a 31 minute video, and it's just mind-blowing. So I can share you the link as well if you're interested at looking at it. I think some of the projects are very very much related to this kind of performances.
Yeah. The particularly found disturbing the sort of massaging of the kind of I don't know, the patrons, kind of the rich patrons kind of next to the cage. And it reminded me of do you know that movie that I think it's called The Square? I think it's a Danish movie. Yeah, that scene where he goes at the kind of donors dinner is a kind of, you know, a sort of similar kind of very disturbing. And that there are other artists who do a lot of work with you know, cages and caged animals as well. I think there's a guy I think that actual performance is based on who's an artist. So but it kind of is that similar kind of very, you know, uncomfortable leading to almost sort of horror, you know, at the end where he starts to kind of, you know, attack and rape one of the guests. And it's like, it's kind of like movement for, you know, the titillating to the totally unacceptable. And I mean, it also kind of, as I remember that film, it unleashes this kind of violence against the artist as well, where the patrons or, you know, the rich men then feel quite happy to all beat the performer up. So there's a kind of that sort of tension between the animal and the human and who occupies that ambivalent role. It's always a dangerous role to occupy, probably.
Yeah, and this is kind of the punishment for the hubris going back to those who transgressed it, no, in a way. Like what's been also called the revenge of nature, or revenge of animal life, or whatever.
Yeah, and I guess too, distance and proximity can work historically as well, where, you know, I mean, I guess from my perspective, looking back at the Brutalist Zoo, you have that historical distance that makes you feel uncomfortable about the Brutalist Zoo, whereas I'm assuming that at the time there wasn't. The proximity meant that it was just accepted and normal. So that's that kind of the way that your historical vantage point, as well as your kind of technical or physical vantage point, produces these different kinds of tensions as well. And so you're working with historical material and contemporary material. So I think you've got that kind of tension working across the breadth of the material.
Yeah.
I just want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the appearance of Thera Naiman, who is going to be presenting later. Thera, since one of the people in your session is not able to attend, we decided to extend this one a little bit, just in case you're wondering why we're still in the previous one. So I think we still have a little bit of time. So are there more comments for either of our?
Yeah, I was going also to point out in relationship to the performance of the couple in a cage. because well, just in that, I mean, there are. Well, I haven't looked into that very systematically again, but there are a few performances of, especially I think women in cages, sometimes along animals. So I don't know if you are aware of that, and it could interest you. And I remember now, for example, there is one that was made by Bonnie Orashek in 1971. And there's also, well, I can post the video also in the chat. And she performed in the San Francisco Zoo, and she was housed in a cage next to the tigers, and she had her lunch there when the tigers were fed also. And so it seems that this is a recurrent kind of performance that has been repeated in different ways and with different contexts and with different intention, I guess.
Thanks.
I mean, it's a recurring anxiety, I think, also in terms of, you know, are we sure we know who is on which side of the bars of the cage? And I mean, since Gail brought up the square, I know the actor who does who plays the chimpanzee in that scene does that because he was in the Planet of the Apes film, where he had to play the chimpanzee. And I know Cuco Fusco also dressed up as one of the one of the apes from the Planet of the Apes. So there is this whole, and Planet of the Apes is, of course, a kind of the original film, an expression of this kind of you know, American middle class anxiety that we might actually end up in cages now that decolonization is happening and that sort of thing, civil rights. So I think there's a whole thick kind of net of different associations about the sort of, I don't know, on the one hand, the anxiety of being in the cage, but also it seems a certain kind of, especially in the film you showed, a certain kind of enjoyment, right, in making people feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. It's kind of the one of the pleasures of creating art as well, no? Like,
and I think that's interesting too, because you see across the other artworks, like I can't remember there's an art of Barcelona, and you know, a Spanish feminist artist in the 70s, and she also did a cage kind of performance where she was in a cage and so were other animals, and the cages were of different sizes. And you know, that those kinds of performances tend to evoke different kinds of emotions to the kind of more bolshy sort of, you know, put it in people's face kind of, so you get the kind of, you know, anxiety or patheticness or other kinds of emotions that that are evoked by a kind of parallel situation. So it's kind of, you know, interesting that, you know, connecting that back to the sort of Hagenbeck, the uncomfortableness we feel about the human zoos from our historic vantage point, when, you know, clearly they were incredibly popular and people loved them. And, you know, in a way they were kind of like Korean pop stars or something, you know, like they really did attract a big crowd and people loved them. And it's like interesting because it, you know, that celebrity thing that gets attached to the sort of star, you know, or the single kind of being wasn't attached to the touring troops, but they nevertheless were incredibly, you know, interesting and popular to people. I mean, it wasn't a sense of animosity that they took along. It was, I think, a genuine, from the material I've read on those kinds of humans, there's a genuine curiosity in most cases about how people lived, and, you know, kind of wanting to go and talk to them and meet them. And yeah, there's some kind of, probably, I mean, it would be interesting to see what kind of diverse material you can find to, I mean, sort of challenge preconceptions as well as kind of reinforce them as well, that, you know.
Yeah.
Marcela, I really appreciated your presentation and your work. I loved drawing a line between the gaze in the zoo and the fetishizing gaze in colonialization in cinema. I don't think enough people create those lines, so I'm really grateful for your work.
Thank you.
I was really also struck by what you were saying in terms of, I think you said how this proximity brings people, or like represents this desire to get as close as possible to the thing, the repressed thing or the thing, but never really crosses that divide into, past that, I guess, initial moment of coming near. And I was thinking about like what that place beyond would be, and whether that's, I don't know, like I don't know if it's empathy or if it's embodiment or some way of relating that is not possible with the fetishizing gaze. And it makes me think, is it possible at all if the thing is considered a thing, right? If it's an object, then my mind goes to thinking about animism, which is, you know, honoring things, things not traditionally considered animate. And I guess that connects back to the kind of the sublime and religious spaces that, Gail, you were maybe also alluding to in the brutal architecture of zoos, this kind of flattening of what I guess Gayatri Spivak considers like the othermost being actually the source and the producer of knowledge, rather than the other way around, with humans positioned as the producer of knowledge. And I guess maybe many people forget that the actual worship that happens, especially in polytheism, is not a flat relationship. It's always kind of continuing your patronage and continuing to kind of understand the language of the spirits, which I think zoology in general could really benefit from. And I think there's advances being made in like speculative ethology, for example, to ask questions that are outside of the human scope. But anyways, thank you, Marcela. It's like got me on a train of thoughts, and I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you. I find it also fascinating to actually go into that theme, which of course goes beyond the scope of these remarks. But that's the question. That's also the question, I think, of anthropology in general right now. You know, like this is. Like, how is it possible not only to understand, you know, other cultures, but other worlds, really? And how are we, to what degree are we willing to let go of, or if it's possible to let go of, all of our prejudices, ideological background as heirs of the Western metaphysics? To actually have another relation to this, another embedded or embodied relation to, you know, nature, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. And I think Joanna had a question.
Thank you for your lecture. There is a poem from Rainer Maria Rilke. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. And this poem is about someone who visits the Paris Zoo, Jardin des Plantes, where the Ashanti are exhibited. And the eye kind of expects, you know, primitive, barbaric, Black people. And then he kind of is disappointed because that is not what he can see. And he is also afraid kind of to look at them, because he is actually afraid of them looking back at him. And so for him, it is easier to, you know, look at the animals, because they, in his mind, cannot look back. And yeah, I also think, yeah, that this is quite interesting, like that we have to keep in mind that those exhibited humans can look back, and then all of a sudden the difference between spectators and spectacle is flipped around, kind of. And yeah, it's just a remark, basically. But I saw in your paper that you, like, I think we have to be a little bit careful to say that those humans have been forced to stage. They have been forced to act like animals and act primitive or whatever, because I mean, we have some sources that, I mean, we cannot generalize that. They have
yes,
been,
yes,
they
this
have
is true.
exhibited people, they understood themselves as actors, they
As
kind
performers, yeah.
of performers. But it's also interesting because they came voluntarily, basically, but most of the time they had contracts with Hagenbeck and other zoo owners, because
not all of them, though. I mean, there were many instances where they were really sequestered.
Yeah, and so yeah, I think that is quite interesting. But then, on the other hand, it doesn't really matter, even if they understood themselves as performers, and even if they enjoyed it, and even if they have been gained some money from that. The European mass learned or practiced their racist and colonial gaze. Because I think the zoo is an institution where Europe kind of learned how to look at, most of the time, Black people in a hierarchic in a hierarchic way. And so,
and also the colonial subjects learn to see themselves in this way as well.
Yes.
This is what this woman calls the third eye. Like, it's like if you had a third instance outside of yourself, where you can see yourself as an other. You learn that you are something other for this person, and so you're kind of internally split.
And quite a lot of narrations that the zoo kind of constructed are still, like, till today, part of our cultural narration, such as, you know, Black people are somehow sexual, more active, you know, things like that. I think that these narrations, cultural narration, have been constructed in the zoo, or at least have been reinforced, or yeah,
that's a very good remark. Thank you.
Just on that, I guess too, I find that, you know, it's a very tricky area dealing with animal studies alongside race studies, and trying to not just reinvent you know, animalization from first principles, if you like. It's kind of like the sort of care and I guess you know, need to deal with those things. I'm not saying that you wouldn't, but I myself get very anxious about the close kind of connection between you know, talking about animals and talking about you know, colonial kind of vision, and there is, of course, literature about thinking about applying those same kinds of colonial kind of studies to animals in zoos. I mean, do animals in zoos see themselves and therefore respond to how they're seen? I mean, there's some, you know, evidence that they certainly do. You know, they know that they're being looked at, and they know that they've got a job to do. They've got to act like a monkey. You know, that they're, I mean, and in that sense, there's a kind of, you know, the monkeys' tea party and the monkeys driving the little cars and all those kinds of things are also kind of, you know, related to that kind of question about the vision that reverses and comes back, and it's like how you see yourself. But yeah, there is some kind of you know, Black studies writing about that kind of a sense of you know, positive closeness to animals, which I find really kind of interesting and moving as well, because that sort of recognition that when you've been animalized, that you can look the other way for companionship and for kind of like a sense of connection. That's that sort of, I think, back to what, you know, Coco Fusco's doing, is kind of trying to reverse that, trying to, you know, fight back, as it were, or reflect back a certain kind of power that's been put in one direction. But, you know, it is, yeah, I guess I just find it a kind of, you know, try not to put my foot in it, I suppose. When dealing with, you know, really great writing about, you know, decolonisation and issues that are still affecting a lot of people, and then we can't just appropriate that and say, you know, animals are people too, and we're treating them like this, because it's not that it's necessarily wrong, but it just, I don't know, I'd be interested to know how everyone else deals with that, because I find it a kind of fraught kind of, you know, level, and yet some of the theory seems very appropriate, or theoretical insights, I should say.
Marcela, do you want to respond to that? We have to end this session.
I'm fine, yeah. Thank you for the
All right,
reminder.
well, thank you to Gail and Marcela for your presentations, and to everybody for sticking around and your comments. I propose that it is now 3 o'clock where I am. I propose that we take a 10-minute break and then start again at 10 past. And that should still give us enough time for Thera and Niharika. Welcome to you both. I will ask you to introduce yourselves when we start again in 10 minutes time. Okay. And welcome you all back to the second session, the first in the modalities of care installation. Welcome also Thera and Niharika. Would the two of you like to tell us who you are and what you're doing here?
Sure, I can jump in and start. Hi, everyone. I'm Thera. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, but currently living in California. And my research, I'll talk about it in a little bit, is on 2 Paris zoos during the second half of the 19th century, early 20th century. And I first came to the workshop in person in 2019, which was great. And it's wonderful to have a community of zoo researchers and scholars to talk about these topics with. So.
Hello, everyone. My name is Niharika, and I'm an art historian. I do mostly 19th century South Asia. And this is my first foray into animal studies. My last work was on light, thinking about artificial light in painting and photography. And so, yeah, I'm curious to see, to basically see the kind of work that is being done in visual studies vis-a-vis the animal. And the perspective that I am taking will try to have this kind of a transnational approach, looking at colonial India and interactions between India and the West. And yeah, essentially I'm interested in the imperial gaze. This, I should say, is that this is part of a larger project, which is very different from what I'm presenting today. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to both of you. Well, Vessel isn't here, so Thera, perhaps you would like to start us off?
Yes, definitely. And is it looks like I can share my screen. The permissions are on, so I'll start with just a brief overview of the documents that I shared in the reader. Okay, so hold on one second. Let's see, can you see the basic, the PowerPoint here?
We can see the main PowerPoint screen.
Okay, let's see. I don't, this is still somehow tricky a year and a half into Zoom. I'm just gonna, okay.
Now we see your presenter view.
Okay. I think I'm just going to, if that's okay, just share this version of the PowerPoint. If people can see that all right. It's taking up my other monitor when I pull up the slideshow view. So let me know if you can't see anything clearly enough, and I can adjust the settings. But I just wanted to start with a brief overview of the documents that I shared and briefly situate them within my broader research project. So my research focuses on two Parisian zoos during the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Jardin des Plantes, which we'll be discussing today, as well as the Jardin d'Acclimatation, which was a zoo founded later, 1860, with a mission of applied natural history that prioritized animals that could contribute their meat, wool, and strength to French agriculture and industry. You know, it's probably more well known at this point for hosting temporary exhibits of living people from North America, Africa, and Asia, which relates to the previous discussion. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. And so while both the Jardin des Plantes and the Jardin d'Acclimatation aim to impose order on nature through categorization, there are various efforts often met with different types of resistance. So in my work, I'm interested in how taxonomies at the zoo were challenged and reimagined by various groups. So visitors, zookeepers, activists, the displayed animals, and at the Jardin d'Acclimatation, the human performers themselves. And so I'm invested in thinking about how the zoos are productive places for alternative ways of thinking about humans, animals, and categories of difference during the late 19th century or Third Republic in France. So I know many of you are familiar with the Jardin des Plantes, but for the purposes of this workshop on the museum, Natural History Museum and zoo together, I wanted to just say a few words about the connection between the French Natural History Museum and the Jardin des Plantes, because they're very closely related, as you can see here. So the menagerie of the Jardin des Plantes, which I'll just refer to as the Jardin des Plantes throughout, even though the Jardin des Plantes is also the park in which the zoo is located. So the Jardin des Plantes menagerie, and just Jardin des Plantes generally, is a branch of the state-funded Museum d'Histoire Naturelle, which I'll just refer to as the museum throughout. And as you can hopefully see in this map, the zoo and the museum shared space within the same park. So you can see some of the galleries of the museum on the lower left-hand and sort of lower part of the map. And then the zoo occupies like the upper right-hand segment of the map here. So they're directly next to each other in addition to the museum governing the zoo. And from its inception during the French Revolution, the Jardin des Plantes was supposed to be a place that would educate French citizens about their place in the natural world. because it offered free admission and it was located in the heart of a working class neighborhood. It was a very popular destination for working families during their leisure time on Sundays. And perhaps more importantly for our discussion today, it was a national zoo. So as a national zoo, the Jardin des Plantes broadcasts information about French scientific and imperial advancement. And so when the Jardin des Plantes showcased a wide variety of animals, it was also telegraphing that France possessed the financial, technological, and diplomatic means to acquire those animals. The museum, which you can see here, was also a research institution, so predominantly a research institution actually. And many of Europe's foremost scientists were on the faculty. So Lamarck, Cuvier, and others are at the museum, sort of drawing on some of the resources of the zoo to carry out their research. So because I'm a historian, I want to briefly talk about archives. So the museum's governance of the zoo, as you can maybe see in this image, is reflected in the archives. And so as a publicly funded institution, the museum has its archives, which are very, very voluminous, housed at the Archives Nationales, which is the French National Archives, pictured here, bottom left corner. And this is really excellent for researchers because the National Archives have preserved pretty much everything. So registers, bureaucratic files, copies of just about every piece of correspondence that went out from the museum. And so it's a really fantastic look into the inner operations of a museum and the zoo during this period. And so I wanted to include the archival indexes, just to very briefly see how this organization is sort of carried out in the archives. So on the sort of left-hand side, you see the AJ category, where you can see that the Natural History Museum is situated alongside a whole other variety of national projects, the Panama Canal, the National Imprimerie Nationale. So it's one of many state-funded institutions and projects. And then on the right-hand side, you can see how the museum's archives are categorized and broken down. And the menagerie has its own section, but then really like documents about the menagerie, about the zoo are present in all of the different categories under the museum. So for the documents that I shared today, those come from this other category, AJ 15565, which is for Voyageurs Naturalistes. And so those are the documents that contain correspondence and guidance that the museum gave to collectors all around the world. So just a few brief words about the documents that I shared in the reader. So the first one is an excerpt from a document entitled Instructions. This is a translation. All the translations are my own, and some of them are a little bit awkward and clumsy, as you probably noticed. For some, I'm still trying to figure out the translations from 19th century French words about, collecting animals, slicing up animals. There's some words that I'm still working out the translations for. So let me know if you have any questions or suggestions there. But this document is written sometime between 1880 and 1900 by Alphonse Milne-Edwards. We can call him Milne-Edwards. It's the American pronunciation, I suppose. And so he was a zoologist at the museum who had become the director in 1891. And in this document, as you hopefully have seen, he is essentially providing a really long wish list of all the species that the museum hoped to acquire for the menagerie and its natural history collections. And what I find really striking about the document is that he provides extremely precise instructions on how to carry out every step of the process in terms of both preparing specimens for the Natural History Museum galleries and also for capturing and then transporting living animals destined for the zoo across long distances, which was a very difficult process that required expertise, even though the people who were carrying out that process often didn't have that expertise themselves. The second document that I've shared comes from the same archival collection, and it's called Elements of Instruction for Traveling Naturalists, co-authored by a variety of professor scientists at the museum. And like the Milne Edwards piece, it was addressed to the Navy, so the Ministry of the Marine. And during the second half of the 19th century, members of the French Navy were stationed across the world. So naval officers had direct access to ecosystems that were populated with the kinds of animals, plants, minerals, agricultural samples, etc., that the museum scientists coveted for their collections and their studies. And some, once again, because these guidelines were intended with individuals who had little to no prior natural history knowledge or experience, they offer a really vivid picture of collecting during the late 19th century. And for this workshop, I've only included excerpts from the sections on comparative anatomy, anthropology, and zoology, because those were most relevant to the zoo and the questions that we're discussing. So hopefully those will spark some conversations and interesting discussions today. Final, brief notes, but these documents are evidence, obviously, of the museum's heavy reliance on colonial networks, and French naval officers are one piece of the puzzle, but they're just one, segment of people who were colonial officers collecting for the museum and for the zoo. The director of the penitentiary system in Guyana collected for the museum, as did a wide array of other colonial administrators. And many of them, if not perhaps most of these collectors, learned the science behind the collecting as they went along, thanks to this detailed guidance from the professors at the museum. And so I hope the excerpted documents highlight the fluidity between the Jardin des Plantes, between the zoo and the museum, while also emphasizing the imperial nature of collecting and the manner in which questions of race and species were intertwined for European scientists. So in the anthropology section, as you've seen, the museum's professor urged members of the Navy to procure human remains, skeletons, organs, skin samples, etc., wherever possible, and whether that entailed autopsying recently deceased people in maritime or colonial hospitals, or digging up tombs, which was a common practice for scientists, European collectors during this period. And meanwhile, the zoology instructions include directives on how to transform zoo animals into museum specimens if any accidents occurred during the long journey to Paris, which they often did. What I think is really interesting is that the same correspondence might be identifying and transporting human remains, animal body parts, and living animals all in the same shipment, possibly to the Natural History Museum and Zoo in Paris. We can talk about this later, but there are some cases not in these documents, but in correspondence from other collectors to the museum about really impromptu sorts of preparation being done aboard ships by people who are not at all trained. So there's a story of a leopard from South Sumatra who died aboard a ship while crossing the Red Sea. It was really hard, especially to keep large mammals alive during these journeys. And in this case, it was the ship's butcher who skinned the animal and prepared the pelt to be sent to the Natural History Museum rather than the zoo. And so this shows how when an animal died on board, the ship's employees had to multitask and take on roles that they, were not trained for. But, a butcher might become a zoological preparer. And it's unclear what happened to the leopard's flesh in this point, but it's possible that the ship's butcher took charge of that as well. It's sort of hard to know. There's another case where the museum is very angry that a giant salamander was thrown off the ship when it died, rather than being prepared to be taken to the museum instead of the zoo. So one final note that relates to anthropology, and this sort of touches on the Jardin d'Acclimatation, the question of, human exhibitions, which I know we were talking about just before this, but the museum, is really directly linked to the Jardin des Plantes, but it also has connections to the human exhibitions that took place at the Jardin d'Acclimatation as well. So anthropologists, for example, from the museum would go to the exhibits at the Jardin d'Acclimatation, carry out examinations, whether forced or not, on the human performers. And what in this case shows that the Jardin d'Acclimatation also profited from the displays of living people, but when these people occasionally died during the tours, their remains could end up in the collections of natural history museums, including the museum in Paris. It's only very recently that the repatriation of these people's remains has, begun in earnest. So on this slide, I just want to briefly talk about, a group of Inuit from Labrador who came to Europe in 1880. So on this slide, you can see from left, Ulrika, Tobias, Abraham, Sarah, and Maria. And they were persuaded by an employee of Carl Hagenbeck to come to Europe to perform in ethnographic exhibitions. And what's really remarkable about this group is that Abraham left a journal. So there's a written record of at least some pieces of his experience in Europe, as did the recruiter, the employee of Hagenbeck, who accompanied them throughout Europe. And so their trip to Europe ended very tragically because Jakobsen, who is the employee of Hagenbeck, forgot to have everyone vaccinated before arriving in Europe or directly upon their arrival. And so all the members of the group ultimately contracted smallpox and died, first in Germany. A few of the members of the group died in Germany, and then the rest died in Paris at the Jardin d'Acclimatation. And so 5 of their bodies, Abraham, Ulrika, Maria, Tobias, and Terianiak, who is another member of the group, their bodies were buried in a Paris cemetery in a common grave. And 4 years later, the museum professor, Quatrefages, who is likely the person who penned the anthropology section in the document that I shared, requested that their bodies be dug up from the cemetery and transferred to the museum's anthropology collection, which they were in the summer of 1886. And to this day, the Inuits' remains are still at the museum in Paris, although in 2013, Canadian and French officials signed a cooperation agreement for, planning for French museums to return Inuit bones to Canada. And so currently the repatriation request is in progress and is ongoing, but it does show how these kinds of questions and issues are still very, very much present today. And I'm sure we'll have conversations later today and tomorrow and Friday about questions of decolonization, repatriation. All right, so we'll stop sharing now. Thank you for your patience in that overview. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on these documents. But I also, so if anyone has any immediate reactions, feel free to jump in. But I also have some, questions or sort of guiding ideas that I'll just throw out there really quickly. One is the question of how specimens were made. Like what are the steps and various kinds of actors required to make, create a specimen, an object of study for the Natural History Museum or for the zoo, which is sort of a project of objectification in various ways. And then I also, something that I think about a lot in these sources, and I know these are just excerpts, is the question of what's missing. Like reading these sources, what strikes you as not being there, not being discussed, and yet still catches your interest. So I'll start with those, but feel free to jump in with any thoughts or comments that you might have.
I think that one thing that strikes me as maybe missing from these documents, or just there are traces of it, are the fact that there are references to reliance on indigenous people in the collection of live animals. Especially there's this reference to, like, you don't have to know how to capture them, just go ask people and they'll bring them to you. So there's this sort of presence of collaboration or reliance on indigenous living people in the live animal section, then sort of no mention of how people might be reacting to the collection of human bodies. So that struck me as a really weird sort of trace of a presence and then also absence. I don't know if you've thought about that aspect of them.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for raising that, because there are brief mentions in these sources, and then in a lot of other related sources within this archival collection, including correspondence from collectors who are in contact with the museum. There's a lot of discussion of the passive voice is used to describe the labor that Indigenous people are clearly doing for the European collectors. Like, I had this trapped, I had this collected. And so that's something that I absolutely think we don't really know, what kinds of finances are changing hands. Like, is this labor paid, and to what extent? Is there violence and coercion that's involved? I'm sure it's a combination of both and spans a wide spectrum, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'll stop in a second, but I'm also curious about how that, there's a lot of detail about the process of preserving bodies, but that passive voice is leaving out a really important part of the process of where the animals actually were being collected and how they're being trapped also. So that's really interesting as well.
Yeah, the proportions of the texts that deal with the actual collection versus the preparation, yeah, you're right, it's really disproportional.
Johanna.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to highlight, there is an interesting documentary, and I can put the link in the chat later on, about Hagenbeck Zoo and how the animals were hunted back in Africa, some original videos. And it's quite interesting because the Europeans had actually no idea how to hunt those animals, how to actually get them, especially elephants. And on page 40 of the PDF document, there is this one sentence where it says, you can easily procure small quadrupeds by asking the region's local residents who know where to find them and often encounter them while hunting. And I thought that's so interesting because the ideology of the European zoos was that only Europeans have the scientific strength, the scientific knowledge of, actually hunting and exhibiting animals. And it's quite the opposite. And because I look at children's literature around the zoo in the late 19th century, and when you look at, for example, some poems from Wilhelm Busch or even Waldemar Bonset, they have some zoo stories for children. And it's so interesting because in these stories, they kind of show, the local residents, the Africans, the Blacks in Africa. That's how they are shown in those stories. They kind of show them as too dumb to, to actually hunt those animals. And then only, the white European person, they had to come to be able to hunt those animals. And I think it's so interesting reading this because like it shows for me that discrepancy in like how it actually like historically what was the case historically versus how zoo stories are narrated for children around 1900. So yeah, and this Abraham Ulrikap is also this family is quite interesting. They have German names and they have been Christianized, they have been baptized. And there was this other family with them. They were Inuk too, but they have not been baptized. And so they have been exhibited differently. Like the Abraham family, they were more civilized than the non-baptized family that was exhibited with them. And Abraham in his diary also like puts himself and his family above this other Inuk family. And it's so interesting how he kind of internalized this European gaze and saw himself as above this other family, but still, you know, under like Europeans.
Yeah. Thank you for all of those comments. I would love to, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat the documentary title that you were mentioning. That sounds really fascinating. Yeah, to your earlier point, I think there is such a mismatch between the displays of power that the zoos and museums in theory are, you know, presenting about French imperial might. And then when you read these documents, the picture that comes through is much more one of sort of incompetence, I mean, in a lot of ways. And, you know, not only because a huge amount of the work of collecting and transporting these animals and, you know, both for the zoo and the Natural History Museum are being done by people who have no idea what they're doing. These guidelines can only do so much. And yeah, they leave out the collecting piece altogether. I mean, the actual capturing of animals and killing animals is mostly absent from these guidelines. And again, through the correspondence, you just see all the different kinds of failures of this process of, you know, successfully transporting specimens to Paris. And it does really contrast very starkly with, you know, the displays once they're put into place in a lot of ways. And yeah, I agree with everything you said about Abraham's diary and sort of how he internalizes the differences between him and his family and the other family. And it's a really, I mean, for anyone who's interested in the human exhibitions, it's a really great resource to look at. And contrasting it to Jakobsen, the Hagenbeck recruiter employee's journal as well, is really compelling as well, because you see these discrepancies between the two journals. There are some incidents that Jakobsen does not talk about at all, even though his journal is much more extensive in scope. Like there's one instance in which Abraham reports that Jakobsen beat Tobias, who's the young man who is part of the Christian group, and Jakobsen doesn't mention that at all. So reading the two in conjunction is really fascinating.
Oh, if I could jump in. So I really appreciated the presentation, as well as reading the documents that you provided, and I actually had different reactions. Well, I had a slightly different reaction. I'll explain why. I was, of course, struck by the level of detail, and even those terms that you couldn't quite translate. I mean, you were creating in English, or or recreating, right, the French of this very specialized medical discourse of dissection and vivisection. So it was incredibly powerful. And also horrifying. But then I just recently attended a public doctoral defense in our department on the exhibition of human remains, and looking at the rhetorics and the publics around those exhibitions. And some of the questions raised there were about the ethics of exhibiting human remains, and also the line that you draw between a person and human remains? And at what point do those human remains become an anthropological or archaeological artifact or an art object for a museum? And I was also then thinking about, in terms of issues of agency and consent that we bring up among animals or non-human animals, right? We bring those issues up quite frequently, or I have myself, with respect to living animals. But I wonder, is there an ethical debate going on too about taxidermied animals and the ethics of exhibiting those animals? So again, like, we have individuals like Jeremy Bentham, right, the utilitarian, who had given his body for the future display and study, and had consented to having his remains mummified and exhibited for all posterity to study. We have some consent from living performers, agents, humans, for exhibiting them alive, right? But that issue of consent and ethics, I wonder, I mean, is that prevalent in the non-human world? And if you could comment on that, and particularly, you know, or is that so human exceptionalist already and anthropocentric that perhaps we don't consider it seriously enough? At what point do the animal remains become an artifact, right, or a museum object? And do we even draw that line, or are non-human animals already posited as an object, so that becomes a moot question?
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. I don't know if anyone has any. Kari, you're saying something about body worlds?
Oh, this was just that there was this, I think it's called Body Worlds, right? It's this exhibition of people who donate their bodies to be exhibited. It's a kind of anatomical displays with people who volunteer to be left to this artist. But it just it occurred to me. The other thing, sorry, I'll let you. But with regard to at what point does it become an object? I find it also really interesting, because you mentioned that you know he was angry that the salamander got thrown overboard, and that basically that a certain kind of value, exhibition value or scientific value, was not ascribed to this body. So I guess it's even more complicated. It's not just it's either living or it's an object, but it's also abject, I guess, would be another category. Margaret, you are desperate to say something.
I just wanted to quickly add up the body worlds point. Jane Desmond has a chapter in Displaying Death, Animating Life, where she compares body world exhibit with taxidermied animals. And she talks about how there's this weird contrast between the ways that the taxidermied animals are made to look very lifelike. Their sort of bodies are perfectly preserved on the outside, but then in body worlds, the skin is removed, and sort of the human bodies are made sort of very different than they look in life, to sort of add comfort to looking at the human bodies versus the objectified animals.
Just on the ethical question about taxidermy, there certainly are artists looking at that kind of question, like Angela Singer's work springs to mind, and she works on taxidermied animals, but only ones that have been rescued from, you know, dumpsters and from others. She never, you know, so the work in a way is a kind of question about, you know, respecting and the artistic process of valuing the body. But it's, I mean, I don't, and Peter Friedel also made a big splash in Documenta a few years back, where his artwork was basically to transport a taxidermied giraffe from Palestine to Castle. And the main kind of aspect of that artwork really was how logistically difficult that actually was. And there were the museum where he got it from was actually like next to the zoo, which is a more abject place you could not imagine than the zoo in Palestine. But, you know, the animals that die just get chuffed off next door, and they have an appallingly, let's just say the taxidermy standards aren't that great. So this giraffe was this sort of strange kind of, you know, badly taxidermied animal that was like the star of the show at the Kassel documenta. So there's kind of a sort of weird set of things, I mean, going on. But certainly I think that there are people in dealing with the art kind of question around the animal who are looking at that question about taxidermy, and there's quite a lot of people working with that. I don't know the extent to which the ethical conversations developed, but one of the things that I looked at recently, which I found extremely moving, was scientists had videoed elephants in Africa around a dead body, and a dead body of an elephant, and it was you know, quite decayed, quite decomposed, and yet elephants were still kind of, when they came across the body, they were gathering to touch it and to lift up the ear and kind of checking out who it was, basically. And it's just kind of, it's just struck me as absolutely fascinating that you could have these desiccated remains as a kind of, you know, reverential kind of object in the landscape in elephant society. And it was such a totally new concept for me that I was a bit, you know, I'm still probably, you know, digesting it, because it's such a different kind of culture of the body as memory and memorial, and elephant bones obviously last for quite some time. And, you know, they're interesting stories related to the kind of whole tusk kind of thing, because they're generally removed from the bodies now to, you know, kind of stop kind of poaching and other kinds of things. And so that's actually kind of having an impact on elephant mourning as well, because they come across these bodies where the faces have been hacked, and, you know, so that, yeah, it's kind of, when you find other ways of kind of dealing with that kind of question of the body, I think. But yeah, it's horrifying, I think, that the absolute callousness with which, you know, someone's remains can be, you know, exhumed, and I mean, in terms of Australian remains and European, you know, Indigenous remains, that's kind of always been a big question in terms of repatriation as well, which is ongoing.
Yeah,
yeah.
And just there's one word even, or line in one of the documents about how if you are sending any type of remain from a human's body, you send the état civil or identification to which the body belonged, and the past tense is used there. I would, yeah, the callousness is really, I'm really stark. I'm really curious to learn more about these hospitals, like the colonial hospitals, as a pipeline for the acquisition of human body parts. I don't know if anyone has read anything about that topic that I can think of now. But also I wanted to sort of say to Margaret's point about that's really interesting about the sort of animals made to look lifelike in taxidermy, and then body worlds, the human body is made to look different than life, because in 19th century Paris, one really prominent attraction that's not supposed to be an attraction, but it is going to visit the Paris morgue and identify, in theory, it's open to the public because they want people to be able to identify bodies of people who have died and been taken to the morgue, but it's really a form of popular entertainment. So I don't know if that helps the thinking at all, or there's just a striking contrast, but so people in 19th century Paris who are going to the zoo would likely, or very probably, also potentially be going to the morgue. So I don't know if that adds anything, or it's just, yes, Atlas Obscura.
And I guess along of the same lines, like the marketplace Les Halles in the middle of Paris, and animals being brought in and slaughtered, and it's a very kind of different and open, kind of a different set of principles about what gets hidden, because of course it still goes on, but it's like how it kind of is conducted.
Yeah, and it's also the period where slaughterhouses are starting to be moved to the outskirts of the city because they're not seen as hygienic, they're not seen as good for the public to be viewing. So that in conjunction with the taxidermy is sort of an interesting contrast too in the late 19th century.
Niharika has had her hand up for a while now. I didn't see it because it's right on your curtains somehow. So.
Okay. Yeah, so my question was basically, the list of countries and animals that you had. I mean, I was looking for the elephant and I didn't see it. And I also know that the elephant was, there was a very celebrated instance of an elephant coming in 1793. So that's over almost more than 100 years after that this document is prepared. And so I'm curious as to what was the criterion by which both the animals and the countries listed there were chosen. I mean, were elephants a part of it, or and if not, why not? And I don't see India there either. Is it part of the sort of the imperial, the French imperial trade networks? So yeah, if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in terms of, there were elephants at the Paris Zoo during this period as well. And there's actually some interesting sort of conflation of African and Asian elephants and how they're presented to the public. So there's one elephant, and that gets mapped onto sort of French colonial efforts. There's one elephant who's called Saïd, is known as Saïd, and is in fact actually an Asian elephant, I believe, but is presented as an African. And so elephants get sort of presented and displayed at the zoo in sort of interesting ways. In terms of the list here, I mean, part of the criteria is just what they don't already have in their collection. So if they already have, an elephant specimen, for example, in the Natural History Museum, they wouldn't necessarily include it here because they feel like they have, enough of a display or enough of a collection. And in terms of the zoo, there's only sort of limited resources for how many animals can be accommodated and fit into the zoo and cared for. And in fact, like a lot of animals the zoo never has enough money. It's really expensive to keep these animals alive, especially large mammals, which consume a lot of food, especially the carnivores too. And there's some statistic about how many pounds of meat they're consuming per day and how that cost relates to the cost of, the zookeeper's salaries for the whole year. So there's sort of a limited amount of resources that they can take on, or for the zoo. And then I think in terms of the list of places, a lot of it would be for where the French naval officers are stationed, which could be colonial holdings or could be outside of the French colonial holdings. It could just be where they're stationed for military purposes, or where collectors happen to be going, because there are a lot of independent collectors as well, who are correspondents of the museum, so receive, they're reimbursed for all of their costs associated with sending specimens back. So it could be well outside of the French colonial holdings as well. But I do like when they say, if you're there, please don't give us a core. I think at one point they say like a Core-9, please don't send us one of those. Like we don't need those. They're very direct about what they do and don't want.
And is it so since they have had more than 100 years of transporting live animals, is this collection, is this sort of this document putting together collated knowledge already and circulating it for people, or is it, it just seems to me that it's rather late in the day. This is like 1880s is when this is. And they've been doing this for a while now.
Yeah, they have been doing it for a while, but I think something to note for the second half of the 19th century especially is that transportation has changed quite a lot. So once you have like the advent of, you know, trains are much more prominent, you have like steamships, like new kinds of transportation technology suddenly makes transporting these specimens more feasible. So the scope of what's possible, at least to these scientists, seems to have expanded, which is why this period is also really crucial for, in their eyes, for expanding their collections.
Okay, thanks.
Matt, you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, sorry, excuse me. Thanks so much for sharing this fascinating material with us. I was really struck by the phrase in one of the descriptions of how to transport live animals, where they emphasize the importance of taming. They say in this phase one cannot spend too much energy in taming them, which is you know, fascinating for me. So one of the things that my research focuses on is that question of the human-animal relationship, and particularly the keeper-animal relationship in the zoo. And the way in which that they insist that the taming animal and, you know, having them get to a point where they're not frightened and terrified of the people taking care of them is really significant, especially when you compare and contrast it to early and mid 20th century discourses in zoos. For example, with someone like Heidegger, for who does insist on the importance of the keeper-animal relationship and taming for their health. But then there's sort of this phenomenon, and I think this ties into Gail's presentation of this, as you get later into the 20th century and that naturalistic conservationist, zoo regime takes over. There's sort of this forgetting or displacement of the human-animal, keeper-animal taming relationship, where, you know, it sort of becomes all about the naturalistic conditions, the diet, et cetera, of the animal for their health, but they're no longer thinking in those terms of taming. So I'm wondering whether, you know, for example, whether they have any guidelines, not just for the collectors, but for the keepers amongst the documents you looked at.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for that that train of thought. So for the keepers, again, these are amateurs, except for the fact that, and this isn't really discussed here, but oftentimes they would hire an indigenous person to accompany the animal to Paris and sort of be the designated caretaker on board the ship. And some of those instances are a little bit odd in terms of the sources that they leave behind, because what seems to be clear is that they often will secure funding for the person to come to Paris, but once they get to Paris, there's no funding for them to return home. And so that has to be made in a separate request. So there's that kind of labor that is carried out in terms of keeping. Sometimes the animal sort of caretaker relationship is much more informal. And I think in these documents, they say, if you can find somebody on board the ship, in other words, somebody who just happens to be on board the ship already, so a member of the crew, probably, who will be the point person for taking care, interacting with the animal, you know, either for amusement or for a little extra money, do that. And you can only imagine what that kind of informal relationship looks like in some cases when it's a sailor with no prior experience working with especially large animals, who's doing it for amusement, taking care of the animal. So I think often, again, like it just comes across as extremely informal, case to case, what kinds of sort of keeper relationships there are. And then even once they get to Paris, this is something I'm writing about in my current chapter about like the zoo as a workplace, but the keepers are generally people, they're paid very little. They work like 12-hour days, 6 days a week. And they're typically people who have no prior experience working in any formal capacity with animals either. So there are a lot of accidents that occur because they, they're in 3 years, I think there are 2 keepers killed by one hippopotamus and another keeper killed by an elephant. And it's, I think, in part because they're not trained to interact with these kinds of large, and in the case of the hippo, at least, very dangerous animals. So the keeper, even the category of keeper, I guess is what I'm saying, is like very expansive when it comes to like formal title, when it comes to training, when it comes to pay. There's a whole spectrum, and it's not very formalized in most cases.
I'm just looking at the time here, I think, but Mariana has a question, and then I think we have to, we should move on to Niharika's presentation.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you, Thera, again. So actually, it kind of follows up on what you were talking about, because I was actually quite struck by this story that you shared during your presentation, because I think it's not so unusual for the butcher to take on the preparing of the animal. And actually what struck me most in this text is that I don't imagine those officers actually cutting an animal like according to the instructions. Like, I mean, they say, okay, you should find someone for a little remuneration to take care of the animal during the journey, or like, okay, pay locals to bring you like small animals or anything like that. But they don't mention pay someone to do this kind of gruesome cutting of the body. And it's a very, I mean, it might sound really gruesome, but it's just a very hard work. It's not so easy to go through and, I don't know, a wild pig and separate the skin so carefully and cut off. I mean, it's just an enormously difficult job. And there's no mention. It made me really think of these images from this documentary Safari by Ulrich Seidel, which shows kind of contemporary safari hunting and actually the locals performing this job for preparing specimens for taxidermy. So this was really, really striking. And the other thing that I wanted to add was that you highlight how this was prepared for amateurs, but I wonder if some of the officers might have been also, kind of hobby scientists. Like, was that the target audience in a way? Because especially in the part of the birds, there's this whole, in general, there's a whole relationship between the empire, animal collecting, and science, and how they affect each other. And it reminded me of the recent book by Kirsten Greer on red coats and wild birds on British ornithologists, and kind of how actually ornithology inspired the colonial expansion. So it's not only kind of the usual story we hear is that, well, the officers were traveling all around the world, so they were giving instructions, and therefore they were kind of, instrumental into this whole situation. Yeah, sorry, someone's calling me for dinner. In the foreign language, anyways. But actually, like, it would be interesting to look at the relationship from the other way around, like kind of how this collecting also inspired the colonial endeavor and how that worked. So if you haven't read this book, I strongly recommend it. I will post a link into the chat. It's really excellent work.
Yeah, thank you so much for that recommendation. I haven't heard of the book, and that sounds fantastic. And yeah, I mean, there are definitely lots of these officers who fancy themselves as like the hobbyists or amateur scientists. And there's a category for people who do a lot of the collecting. They can become like official correspondents and receive like a yearly stipend from the museum. So there are definitely different tiers of, how official they are, how amateur they are. But yeah, that book sounds fantastic. I'm definitely going to read that. Thanks.
Okay.
If anyone,
sorry.
just one announcement. If anyone knows of any books that actually concern zoos, animal collecting, and military endeavors, please share. I'm interested in that topic. So, yeah.
All right. I'm sure that we will have a running reading list. We did at the last workshop. I will at this point perhaps also remind everybody that if when the meeting ends, the chat will disappear into the ether, and so if there's anything in there that you think you might want to look at later, you should download the chat before you leave. Okay, this is best practices from the last workshop. Okay, Thera, thank you so much. Niharika, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So first off, apologies for saddling you with the longest reading for this session. My contribution to this is a paper. I wasn't very clear about sort of how the workshop, the format. So it's sort of a work in progress that I submitted. And what I thought I would, since I had already given you this a lot of reading, and I thought I would do today would be to sort of contextualize that a little bit, since that was for sort of a South Asian studies journal. And yeah, to try to keep these comments a little brief and leave a lot of time for feedback, which is what I would actually really interested in building conversations there. Okay, so let's see, share. Exactly to do that part either. So I'm saying, okay, here. Okay. So my interests here are basically in the visual representation of elephants, particularly in how they come to represent India, but also in the wider visual economy that emerges in the late 18th century and coincides with the physical trade in elephants that begins at the same time. So I'm interested in thinking about how this new visual economy that is sponsored by an imperial trade produces an imperial gaze that I suggest is anthropocentric. I'm trying to think transnationally about the craze for seeing the elephant that emerges between the 1790s and continues through the 19th century, and that's widely reflected in visual culture, and consider what it says about how practices of seeing are implicated in our relationship to animals. My interest in this was piqued by the phrase seeing the elephant that emerged as a colloquial Americanism by the mid-19th century, and the corresponding tale of the blind men and the elephant, or the phrase the elephant in the room, and how they were all about practices of seeing, the impossibility of seeing the whole, or how somebody who had seen the elephant was considered a world-weary traveler who had seen it all. As a visual historian, I wanted to know in what way the elephant was associated with sight. And this is an image that that was not part of the readings, but it's from the Punch, and it actually has a person behind the camera with the tent over it, and how that mimics an elephant, and was called the Elephants Photographicus. So there are many, many ways in which the elephant begins to be invoked in terms of metaphors for vision and for seeing. And that was what I was sort of really interested in here. So the elephant, as we know, stands as a common visual motif for India, an association that emerged largely from 19th century colonial prints, where it stood as a symbol that typically adorned the Indian picturesque landscape. The colonial fascination for the elephant was manifested in a wide range of visual imagery. What you see here is the one on the right is from the Crystal Palace exhibition, where they actually had a stuffed elephant in the Indian section. The elephant was showcased and often followed local, the British participated in a lot of these events where elephants were showcased And while they were in India, they followed local practices like watching elephant fights, or the gifting of elephants, or the use of elephant for transport. And all of these are reflected in the prints and paintings of the period that you see. And a large part of this was because the British started procuring and owning a large number of elephants because they were an integral part of the army, and they performed a strategic role in warfare. And prior to the advent of the British, before the British started investing in the elephant was already a much revered animal in India. And there's an argument that has been made about a model of kingship based around the access and control of the war elephant, which served as a primary arsenal of the army. The person who's made it is someone called Thomas Troutman, and he suggested that this model of royal power depended upon the military strength of the war elephant and held sway from 1000 BCE until the 19th century, and extended beyond India from Southeast Asia in the east to Spain in the west. Spread largely through diplomatic ties, gift exchanges, and royal hunts, or militarily through war and tribute taking, this model of kingship extended to the ancient Persians, Carthaginians, and Romans, circulating ideas, assets, knowledge, and practices about the use of elephants to become what he deems a universal norm for kingship. At the heart of this imperial power lay the war elephant. And he says this, that elephants are large, publicly visible signs of military potential, of a substantial living force at the command of a king. Their public movement and circulation between kings thus become functions drawing meaning from the war elephant. From this perspective, then, the religious veneration of elephants stems from their significance from the significance of the war elephant to matters of state, flowing from kingship to religion, not the other way around. Ceremonial processions of elephants were accordingly a display of war assets. And large-scale royal hunts, the capture and display of elephants, all served to underline imperial power, to impress upon the king's subjects, as well as rival states, the ceremonial splendor he could command. In Mughal and Rajput India in the 16th and 17th centuries, close personal relationships were forged between elephants and kings, and the elephant was accorded a reverence as an imperial attribute of power. The Emperor Akbar, who was one of the best-known rulers of the Mughal Empire, for instance, and he is here in this astride an elephant here. Akbar, for instance, had at any given time as many as 101 elephants for his personal use, each given a name and trained staff to care for them. Akbar's adoption of the elephant and his cultivation of skills in riding, management, and training the elephant conferred attributes of prowess and virility upon him, as he embraced this Indian symbol of imperial authority. And so this becomes sort of, the elephant becomes an established symbol of imperial authority in India, as Tom Troutman says, from ancient times. But Akbar was also a Mughal ruler who has this Turco-Mongol background, which had used the horse primarily, which relied upon the horse for its that was part of its warrior culture. So when Akbar adopts the elephant rather than the horse, he is making a claim to kingship to Indian kingship rather than from the Turkish-Mongol background. And he privileged the male musk elephant, the elephant that was in musk. And this is a painting from what is called the Akbarnama, which is sort of a biographical manuscript, and describes how he sort of is riding this elephant whose name is Hawaii. And he had actually won this elephant in a very famous battle. He is sort of, it's rampaging across this pontoon bridge, and people are, this sort of this state of disarray. And it sort of conveys his mastery over the elephant conveys his serves as an allegory for his ability to govern over an unruly state and bring it to calm. So effectively, when the British started adopting the elephant, and they had to in India, they had to reckon with how the elephant stood as an imperial attribute of power. And so for them to be effective rulers of the Indian territories, they had to be able to see to manage and adopt the elephant as an imperial attribute of power. So they accordingly adopted practices of elephant warfare, including the animal within its military procurement operations, and also adopted common rituals of gifting animals, maintaining menageries, elephant parades, processions, and watching animal fights. These practices, as they were documented, also served as examples of the British access to and control of an insignia of royal power, underlining their right to rule over the state. So now by the 18th century, British monopoly, this is actually the late 18th century, British monopoly over the elephant trade, its capture and its supply for its bases in India, as well as for diplomatic gifts and menageries abroad, rewrote local monarchical privilege and access to elephants. Where local rulers had access to forests and land for the capture of elephants, now the British effectively controlled elephant acquisition and supply. This made the elephant available both for private usage amongst wealthy Indians, as well as for the thriving animal trade abroad to be exhibited in menageries. So the menagerie allowed for a convenient point of translation between royal practices of animal ownership of the past to newer models of elephant spectatorship associated with natural history and eventually the zoo. In the 16th and 17th centuries, royal menageries had stood as an example of the monarch's dominion over the natural world and its exotic beasts. In the new avatar at Barrackpore, which is, I think I have a slide here. This is a site, a menagerie that the British set up in 1801, close to Calcutta. So in this new avatar at Barrackpore, the menagerie was established as part of a larger institution of natural history and employed naturalists tasked with producing a natural history of India. The Barrackpore menagerie was based in Calcutta, which had served as the British capital, and also stood as an important port in the animal trade route between Southeast Asia and Europe. Inasmuch as the menagerie was a forerunner of the zoo, many royal menageries in India were converted into zoos from the 1880s onwards. The viewing practices established in the menageries were also adopted by the zoos. Elephants were typically not caged in Indian menageries. They had large stables called hathikhanas, and were used to provide rides to viewers of the menagerie. And these stables, I mean, they're called stables, but they're architecturally resplendent in many cases and from ancient times onwards. So, they were very well looked after in the menageries in India. But in Britain, the elephants were caged within small enclosures. In this new avatar in cages in the menagerie, the elephant still retained its value as an insignia of royal power, but its threat was contained within the cages, which greatly diminished its agency. So the emergence of elephant killing as a sport only emerged in the 19th century. Once again, hunting was an activity associated with royal prerogative. But the British introduced elephant hunting with powerful guns and made it into a manly symbol associated with the aristocratic class and adorned their homes with trophies acquired from hunting. In India and Africa, the elephant hunt was a popular sport for colonial officials, and drawings and trophies allowed for the memorialization of the hunt as a courageous act. So there's a little bit of a difference between how elephant hunting happened in India and in Africa. In India, essentially, elephants were not hunted until the early 19th century. And while Africa served as a great, they were commonly hunted in Africa. And part of the argument is that because they were so revered in India, elephants were so revered, that there was no that they weren't really hunted. And there was, in fact, there is a book from 1808 says that, this person says that he doubts if it would be possible at all to hunt elephants for sport in India because of the veneration that it commanded. And yet by around the 1820s and 30s, it begins to be, that there is this, it starts, and it's usually under the guise of crop protection that the rampaging elephant is destroying crops. And so, it begins, and then thereafter, there are certain parts of India in which elephant hunting is allowed to take place. Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka, is one of the primary ones. The Thera region in the north is another, and where there are a large number of elephants. And towards the close of the 19th century, 1870s onwards, it already becomes, it becomes a problem. Too many elephants are being hunted, and there are measures to sort of put a stop to the practice. So if in India, the elephants were killed, and they were, this is the Prince of Wales in his trip to India in 1776, I think it is. And in a sense, that there is this statement where he says, you must be seen to kill the elephant. And there was this practice of sort of cutting off the tail and standing with the elephant, which I have to say was apparently even one of the Trump sons also had this photograph of killing the elephant and sort of exhibiting, standing on top with its tail. But yes, it becomes a sort of an example of this kind of virile masculinity associated with an aristocratic class at this time. So if elephants were killed, and there was this whole visual culture of representing the animal killed and standing on top of them. In Europe and America, the kind of killings that took place were these public execution of elephants. And you had the most famous examples here is Chuni from 1826, I think it is. And this is Topsy, who is the elephant that was electrocuted, the circus elephant that was electrocuted by Edison in a show of the powers of electricity, and was made into a short film. So essentially, the colonial engagement with elephants in India allowed the British to both adopt royal privileges associated with elephant ownership and display, even as it granted this access to a wider public through its control over elephant procurement and trade. A number of wealthy individuals, both in India and abroad, were able to own elephants in private menageries and adopt the ways of the monarch. So this is what I call a certain kind of a democratization of royal privilege, in quotes. And to understand this, I relied upon Derrida's reading of an early elephant autopsy in Versailles in the court of Louis XIV in 1619. And this is sort of the skeleton of that elephant that was dissected. The scene of dissection at Versailles was witnessed both by the emperor as well as a team of anatomists conducting the autopsy. And for Derrida, it outlines a transfer of power from the sovereign ruler who lorded over man and beast to the sovereign subject of modernity through the gaze. In this case, the scientific vision that was premised on autopsy, or the act of seeing with one's own eyes. The dissection sought, on the one hand, to set up the idea of sovereign knowledge, this idea of sovereign knowledge you are able to verify with your own eyes. On the other hand, the presence of the sovereign at the scene also made it an exhibition of the sovereign's power, his absolute power over man and beast. So Derrida sets it up as a confrontation between the absolute power of the sovereign and the autonomy of sovereign knowledge implied in the natural history model, both of which rely upon the gaze to assert itself. So Derrida contends that the structure of sovereign power exhibited with the emperor watching the dissection does not disappear after the French Revolution. He says that rather with the execution of Louis XVI, it was only transferred from the monarch to privileged individual members of the fraternity. He says, this is a quote, "One has simply changed sovereigns. The sovereignty of the people or of the nation merely inaugurates a new form of the same fundamental structure. The walls are destroyed, but the architectural model is not deconstructed. And it continues to serve as a model, even as an international model, what he calls a globalization of an optics based on such an autopsic model." So he proposes that the new architecture of animal exhibition with public zoos that were envisioned as a scientific display of animals to replace the royal menageries maintains the gaze as an alternative mode of control over the animal, asserting human sovereignty vis-a-vis the beast. In the case of the elephant, its association with royalty, its gigantic size, and its potential ability to inflict harm as a war beast meant that acts of incarceration and control transferred associations of sovereign power to the imperial viewer. Scenes of elephant executions or elephant subjugation and captivity were therefore visual demonstrations of the imperial subject's mastery over the natural world. Once an accessory of royal power, now available for entertainment acts to a wider public, the popular access to the symbol of monarchical privilege spoke to a notion of demotic sovereignty that modeled itself on the sovereign's dominion over the natural world. Its exhibition in triumphal pageants then celebrated the spoils of conquest over both the natural world and the colonial lands where the elephant had thrived. So yeah, essentially my task here was to see how in as much as the elephant was this symbol of royal power, and and what happened once the British came, and on the one hand they adopted it as a symbol of royal power, taking over from previous rulers who had used the elephant. On the other hand, they kind of sort of opened it up to trade, which allowed the common person, okay, the common meaning an aristocratic person, individual, access to this symbol of monarchical privilege. So in what way did the kind of the sovereign's power, which was at play in the menagerie, where the sovereign collected all of these exotic beasts from different parts of the world and claimed to be lord over it, this sample of the natural world. In what way was that idea transferred to now this whole new class of individuals, aristocratic class of individuals who had access to this, the elephant, to this royal symbol of power? So I can stop share. Take questions.
Thera, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It's really great to see all of those images together too. I was sort of wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the impact of ivory in terms of like elephants' perceived value, alive or dead. In part, I'm thinking about this because last year a student of mine did a research project on like the ivory trade in Africa, and how that, like that there's a booming ivory trade there versus India when it came to elephants. And I know you're on colonial India here, but you're also talking about the US and Europe as well. So I don't have a clear-cut question exactly, but I'm curious about if you have any more thoughts on ivory and sort of the commodification of the elephant, sort of body parts in death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole list of the ways that the different body parts get used. And ivory is sort of the one that has the longest history, but in the 19th century, there's this horrific image of that I saw of the leg of the elephant being used as furniture, as an umbrella holder. So the elephant, there are all sorts of ways in which it gets used. Ivory, interestingly enough, is associated only with the African elephant because, again, elephant killing was allowed in Africa. In India, you did not have elephant killing at all. And so there are a lot of ivory objects that you find in India, but ivory is actually imported in from Africa. So there are these trade routes, but because of this kind of prohibition of killing the elephant in India, you do not see, ivory had to be imported in. And so the entire ivory trade is really premised, it really starts, takes off from the African elephant. In fact, I just read this news article saying that they are now genetically transforming to lose their tusks because the African elephant, because as a way of sort of protecting against killing of the elephant. So yeah, I mean, it has a sort of an indirect effect in the Indian case.
I think Mariana will have something to say about this.
Yes, ivory, of course. I think like just to add to what Niharika already mentioned is that India was one of the largest processing sites for ivory objects. So basically, was happening in India, mostly in the 19th century.
Mariana, you're breaking up. Is she still here?
Can't hear.
She's gone. Johanna, do you want to take over while we wait for Mariana's internet to recover?
Yeah, maybe she has to go out and come in again or something, but yeah. I wanted to think a little bit about how the practice of hunting is connected to a certain concept of masculinity, or how hunting is connected to patriarchy. Because in those images you showed, we only saw males, and till today, it seems to me that hunting is such a male hobby. And then when we think about that more, like in general, colonialism also is linked to a certain concept of masculinity. And then in our context, how is the institution of the zoo connected to patriarchy? Like, how does the zoo also construct a male gaze towards the body, like in general, to the animal body or to the human body? Yeah, it's just a lot of questions, sorry.
No, lots of intersecting things there. So I would say, yes, this idea of a certain kind of masculinity that's associated with hunting is, a number of people have written about it. And again, it becomes a sort of a way to show, of course, your power over this giant animal. And by now you have these very powerful guns. There is this one, I mean, there are horrific stories about the number of elephants shot by, there was this one character, Cummings, who had, I think it's like 27 in a day, or it's just horrific numbers that you have. And they become sort of these bragging, boasting rights. And then again, they are commemorated by, they're commemorated in the living rooms and homes through these taxidermied displays. So in a sense, that moment of triumph over this animal lives on in these in these taxidermied displays in the homes of these individuals. And it's very clearly a class thing. And so, there is a certain sort of an aristocratic class for whom the display over this animal is seen as important to assert a certain kind of identity in that class. I also want to say, however, is that even with that Akbar painting that I showed, where he's astride that elephant, that too has been read as an example of a certain kind of virile masculinity that Akbar is, his idea of taming the elephant and the fact is it's an elephant in must. An elephant in must is the one that's a rampaging elephant. And so it's especially hard to tame at that point. And so, his ability to bring it under control becomes a kind of a way of suggesting his own superhuman powers. And I want to say that this idea of taming an elephant has had a long history. I mean, there are images of Buddha taming an elephant. That's a different kind, I guess, of notion of masculinity there. But with Akbar, you have this very clearly a virile masculinity and he loved elephants in must. So he had a number of them. So, there is a tradition of this kind of a masculine power asserted over the elephant that is there both with Akbar as well as in the later tradition of killing an elephant. Now, Akbar, of course, never killed an elephant, but it was more of taming an elephant.
I see Mariana is back with us.
Sorry.
Do you want to try again?
What did you hear? Because I think I kept talking and I was kicked out. So I don't know where.
We heard basically nothing. You said that India was the place of ivory processing, and then that was about it.
Oh, right. Okay. So I just wanted to mention that in my sources, I found that in Asian elephant, they would perform this thing where they would cut off the tusks of living elephants and then cup them with copper or some kind of like metal cups. So in this way to not kill the elephant and still procure ivory. And that was practiced in British colonial India, of course. And then you also mentioned the exhibition at the Crystal Palace, and I think that is where they exhibited this famous ivory throne for the Queen, right? Which was like a huge gift, and it was largely debated. So yeah, just some fun facts about ivory.
Yeah, from Trivandrum, basically the south of India where elephants abound, which is abutting Sri Lanka, where tuskers are specially prized. And so, yes, the ivory throne is from there.
I thought you were going to talk about your intervention of painting the tusks pink recently, but maybe
if you want me to, I can mention that. But yeah, I mean, also if we're thinking about working elephants, removing their tusks is quite useless because they need them quite a lot. So if in India they would use them for logging because they were so much used in forestry, that they would not cut off the tusks because they were extremely important for the work that the labor that the animal was performing for them. And about the intervention, so recently I've been part of an exhibition. It's still on. The exhibition is on at the Natural History Museum in Wrocław in Poland. And yeah, we were working with colleagues from the cultural anthropology department, and they organized this fantastic class for students that was taking place in the museum. So in the back room of the museum, so where all the, you know, weird taxidermied things and skins are. And then the final task for students was to plan an intervention into the collection, which like the director of the museum gladly allowed us to do. And that's quite unusual because they were very open for many types of intervention. And when I was there teaching my class, just in passing, I mentioned, like, I wonder if you would let me paint the tusks of this elephant skeleton. And they said, well, tell us more about it. And they totally agreed to do that. So there's a skeleton of an elephant, which comes from the zoo in Wrocław. They don't know when to date it for exactly, and that we could not identify the individual animal very well. But they allowed me to paint the tusks into very bright pink color. And this is because there was, maybe some of you have noticed, but there was for a moment like an internet meme about elephants with pink tusks roaming in Africa, but that has actually never happened. The elephants never had their tusks really painted pink. It was just done in Photoshop. But there was a proposal from conservationists, wildlife conservationists, to use this technique of dyeing the tusks of living animals pink in order to prevent the poachers to kill them. It has been done with rhinoceroses, so they are infused with a special chemicals also that not only make them turn pink, but also make them poisonous, because the rhinoceros horns are used for traditional medicine in China. So they make the person who would ingest it quite sick. So something similar was suggested for elephants, but in fact, it never happened. But I kind of wanted to imagine how that would look like, and we did. And just for your information, the tusks are replicas because, of course, the ivory cannot be on display in that museum. So they're made of wood, and it was not invasive at all for the specimen on display. But yeah, it was quite an interesting process, you know, of also the museum workers helping me to remove them and then painting them in the parking lot of the museum and all of that. And it catches everybody's attention immediately. And there's a description attached that is basically trying to raise awareness about ivory trade. And because it's still a huge business nowadays, of course. So that was my intervention, and that's maybe it in the topic of ivory.
Thank you. It's fascinating.
Concha.
Well, Niharika, first, I liked very much both your presentation and your paper. And it, a lot of references also popped into my mind. And I really liked how you introduced the topic, like discussing all these elephant-related phrases and their meanings. And that also brought to my mind a story about elephants moving the mud of the river in order to make they were not able to see their appearance because they thought they were ugly. And I don't know where this comes from. Somebody told me that it might come from Pini or maybe, but I just wanted to mention it in case it was of interest. And also really liked what you mentioned about how the elephants provided a vantage point of view in order to see the surroundings and how this is related to power. So I also really like that. And I wanted to mention, just in case, I don't know if you know about the talking about elephants and kings and imperial power. I wonder if you knew about the elephant, one of the elephants, but Carlos III, Charles III of Spain, which is displayed in the Museo de Ciencias Naturales de Madrid, the National Natural Science Museum in Madrid. The taxidermy and the taxidermy elephant and the skeleton, just in case you didn't know about it. It's an Indian elephant, and well, I can also share an article on it in the chat well, it's in Spanish, but then the images are there and they might be interesting to look at. And regarding what you mentioned about like this transfer of power, well, maybe it's taking this too far, but I think it can be related also. But it's interesting that, well, our former king, well, I don't know if some of you know, but he had to flee the country because in order to avoid legal persecution. So he's currently out of Spain, and he supposes he cannot return. And his downfall started with the killing of an elephant, an African elephant, because it was displayed how he did that in Africa. And what was once I think like a powerful thing to do in order to establish power, it was like it had a lot of people rejected that, and he had to ask for forgiveness. And that was the first time he did that. And it was like the start of his downfall. And then all the economic scandals came about, and many other things, but all started with the killing of an elephant. So yes, so you knew.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually really interesting. That sort of, you know, an example of the king that you mentioned at the end. I know that there was another campaign, I think it was like a dentist or something who had gone to Africa and killed an elephant, and people bombarded his house. And so in a way that act of killing the elephant, and which was seen as heroic, it's really interesting that how that has changed. But in this case, you know, that wasn't a dentist. I mean, to having the king himself, that's actually really, really interesting.
Yeah, it was like it was the first, it was very well commented in the press and all that, because it was like a transition from like this very powerful king that nobody criticized in the press and all that, from to be like, it was like fair game from that moment on to criticize him, and it was like a really point in what where that changed. And so it was, yeah, because of the killing of this well, it was an African elephant, but anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
Margaret.
Thank you for this paper. I was wondering if in your research you had dealt at all with thinking about the ways that humans were contributing to the appropriation, the British appropriation of elephants as a royal symbol, or to this sort of idea of representing India abroad, in terms of like when elephants were accompanied by Indian handlers, or when white handlers would sort of dress up in what they were imagining as Indian costumes. I was just wondering how you were dealing with that, or if you were engaging with that.
Yeah, there are a number of incidents of you know, the mahout who typically accompanied the elephant, and sort of all stories about how he was so close, etc., to the elephant, and how the elephant sort of you know, could not adapt easily to if the mahout left. And I should say that it was not just the elephant that you know, that had handlers accompany it. There were many others that other animals too often had handlers accompany them. I know that sort of a gift that was given to Queen Charlotte also had the handler accompanying. It's called a domestic of the Nawab. You know, was sent alongside the elephant. I mean, I know of incidents where you know, there were you know, Western handlers, and stories about some of them of stories of cruelty to the animal, stories again of friendship with the animal. You know, I'm not sure I have seen imagery of, you know, of Western handlers with the elephant, and sort of, you're saying a kind of the equivalent of a blackface in that. Yeah, I'm not sure how. I haven't thought about that specifically. I know that it becomes very popular in, I mean, that there's a film, Sabu, who is actually an Indian actor who comes across to America and is there, I think, the 20s, 30s, and is an elephant handler. And it becomes a kind of a trope of this elephant and his mahout. Is kind of a close relationship between that. But yeah, I don't know about European elephant handlers and specifically how to think exactly about that yet. Yeah, something to think about.
Oh.
Yeah, the sound. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. But I was just thinking when we were talking about sort of the hunting as sort of one side of sort of this almost spectral ownership of the elephant, and also sort of on this idea of the democratization of the power that has been invested into the elephant in a sense. And I know you maybe looked at around the somewhere in the 19th century, but I was also wondering how that sort of still resonates today, not only with hunting, but also sort of with tourism, which also sort of has these, well, mainly foreign people riding these elephants for pleasure, and also sort of, yeah, well, I was just wondering if you thought about that or had any ideas on that, sort of how this ebb and flow of how the elephant is used throughout the ages, sort of, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, one of the ways in which I think the elephant gets used in which kind of continues that tradition with the new nation state is that it's still frequently, and it was still frequently given as gifts, diplomatic gifts between nations. So, you know, it's very common to have that, you know, elephants be given. I know that there was one donated to the Washington Zoo sometime in the 60s, and there was when India first held its in the Asian Games, I think this was 84, was you know, the elephant, the way you have a mascot for the games, it was the elephant. And so there has been a way in which that that tradition of you know, the way that the elephant signifies the Indian nation has been continued by the post-colonial nation as well, in new ways and in giving it a new form. And in terms of the question about people riding elephants, what exactly did you, could you clarify what you?
Well, I was more thinking about indeed sort of what that sort of that you have these tourists sort of as almost as a tourist attraction, you can sort of ride on an elephant. And I don't know, I was sort of thinking about how it's weird that sort of that once the king rode upon the elephant and now it's tourists from, I don't know, from Germany or something. I don't know.
Yes. No, I think that's certainly there. That there is a great deal of fascination, but still that practice, you still had elephants in zoos, you know, the way Barrackpore Menagerie had an elephant to give a tour, you still had elephants in zoos until very recently, giving rides to people. Yeah, something else that that just struck me was that Princess, I think it was Princess Diana's brother, Mark Shand was the name of this royal, and he was he wrote this book, I think, called Travels on an Elephant. So, you know, you still have some kind of royalty coming in, riding an elephant, and he had this big elephant conservation nonprofit. And so you still have, you know, remnants of that kind of royalties association with elephants, and then attaching that to sort of the more kind of the hippie exploration of America, of India, with Mark Shand, you know, going around tours on the elephant, going to the elephant fairs where elephants were sold, Sonpur Mela, and then going around the country on an elephant. So there are some of those kinds of sort of crossover stories there.
Interesting, thank you.
Okay, I'm just looking at the time. I think we should stop. Mariana, you still have your hand up. Do you want to? Is that an old hand?
It's not an old hand, but for the sake of everybody's time, I can skip.
Okay, I'm sure there will be. Well, we will have ample opportunity in the coming days to come back to the elephant question. We, as I said at the beginning, the keynote will be at past, so in half an hour, and is in a different Zoom meeting, which means that I am going to stop the recording now and close this meeting. So if you want to save what is in the chat, now is your chance to do that. And I will see you all over in the other meeting in half an hour's time for the keynote. Okay.
And thank you so much for all the stuff on the chat. I have been copying them, and we'll take a look. Thanks so much.
Yes. And thank you, Niharika and Thera, for your very interesting presentations. Okay.